listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition, another 3 hours this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more from across these disunited states and the surface of our increasingly divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all having a good morning. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 483 new coronavirus deaths and 70,355 new cases were reported in the United States on April 19th. That's yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 67,175 cases per day, an increase of 4% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Monday morning, more than 31,761,200 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 567,200 have died from it. In all of the United States, in Washington, D.C., and in Puerto Rico, vaccines are now available to all adults. This comes as upwards of half of the American public have received at least one vaccine shot. It also comes after President Biden set a goal of administering 200 million doses by his 100th day in office, which the nation seems set to meet. And the CDC is meeting this Friday to evaluate adverse effects from the J&J shot, saying it, quote, hasn't been an overwhelming number of cases, but what we're looking and seeing what's coming in, end quote. Fauci has said he expects a warning will be added to the shot, but that it will still be available for use, which is probably the right way to do it, honestly. And like I was saying before, if it seems to, if the cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, this rare blood clot condition that seems to be induced in some rare cases by the J&J shot as well as the AstraZeneca shot, if it seems to only cause these things in younger women, it seems like you could pretty fruitfully just restrict it to other parts of the population, and you'd be okay. You wouldn't even see that very rare side effect. So hopefully they do that, and hopefully they try something like that over in Europe too. That would cut out, I don't even know, like a quarter of the that would make it available to like 3/4 of the population or something like that. I'm splitting it up kind of dumbly, perhaps in my head. Young women, young men, old men. And, if you're not giving it to young women, you're giving it to the other three. And, maybe that's not exactly 25%. Maybe that's more like 30 or 35%. But still, my point is, that's a lot of the population that you could administer this shot to, whether we're talking the J&J or the AstraZeneca. Jamarl, what are your thoughts?
I think you're right. I mean, all things being equal. But look, any limitation that you put on it will adversely affect how other people in the demographic sees it. So I agree with you, but you're still going to get, I guess, some level of cognitive, psychic impact for doing so. But routinely, I agree. You can eliminate the main thrust of the people who are adversely affected by it, and you can handle the politics of it in a way that doesn't necessarily destroy the ability for the vaccine to be used, in a larger population. No, I agree.
Yes.
It's a better way to deal with it.
I'll put it like that. That seems like it's better than the alternative of just sort of blanketly cutting its use off. Or in Europe, what you see is different countries doing an age restriction, which, okay, I guess that makes sense, but give it to men of all ages. If men aren't experiencing these side effects, if they're not getting the CVST stuff, the blood clotting, just, give it to the young'uns too. I don't care. And then ideally, I guess what you would do there is you would, try to prioritize the delivery of other safer mRNA vaccines to the younger women. And, you just sort of split it up based on demographics. That makes sense to me. It seems a little bit too simple, and that's probably why they're not doing it. Anyway, the country of India on Monday registered 273,810 new infections and 1,619 new deaths from the coronavirus, with the state government announcing yesterday that vaccines would be available to all adults from the start of this next month. Their healthcare system is struggling it has not yet imploded. It is not yet overrun, but it is nearing or at capacity in many cases, from what I hear. Now, granted, this is, if you look at the population of India, I think it's something like 1.3 billion people. In the United States, we've only got, 330 million, a fraction of India's population. And we saw numbers higher than this, particularly much higher than this in the daily death toll mid and late last year. So on a per capita basis, interesting to note that if you can trust these numbers, if these numbers are right, India is still doing significantly better than the U.S. was when it hit its peak last year. But that doesn't mean that things are going well. Their healthcare system is, again, struggling. They probably are relatively ill-equipped in terms of the healthcare capacity, in terms of hospital capacity, to be able to deal with this kind of thing. So that's not saying it's a good situation. It is not. It is spiraling out of control there, and it just keeps getting worse. Anyway, in national political news, yesterday the prosecution and the defense gave their closing arguments in the trial of Derek Chauvin over the killing of George Floyd. Now the jury has gone into deliberations, a process that could take just a few days or could take longer. The defense asked Judge Peter Cahill to rule a mistrial following words from California Congresswoman Maxine Waters. The judge denied that request, although he did caution that Maxine Waters' comments could give the defense room to appeal the verdict of the trial. Waters had called on protesters to become more confrontational, quote unquote, this nights after dozens were arrested by Brooklyn Center police. Barbed wire and armed soldiers are currently set up around the Minneapolis courtroom to guard it in the event of riotous protests. And Minnesota's governor has activated 125 National Guard to support Minnesota police in preparation for the delivery of the verdict. It seems like we've just entered a state of sort of like toggle on, toggle off martial law in a way that I don't think maybe 50 years ago, late 60s, we would have had this kind of thing. But between last summer's Black Lives Matter protests, what happened on January 6th, and then the subsequent car attack on the Capitol, it seems like we're just sort of on a hair trigger, ready at a moment's notice to send out police and maybe the cavalry to push back against the citizens of the United States. And on the one hand, that's sickening. And on the other hand, it's disgusting that we're at that point in our society. On both hands, it's not a very good situation, I guess, is my point. I don't like the fact that we're here. Jamarl, do you see that? Am I overplaying this? What do you think? I cannot hear you.
Well, I don't know if you're necessarily overplaying it. I do see where you're coming from. I mean, look, I would say that the temperature that seems to be in the country right now is a direct result of economic factors that have turned the country in on itself. Like where basically the resources aren't distributed in a way where people don't have this thing where they're at each other's throats in a significant way. I mean, you add into it violence, you add into it what seems to be an unempathetic basis. Like there's all sorts of things that seem to interplay into this. But no, I don't think you're necessarily entirely overblowing it. There does seem to be something wrong, if that makes sense.
Yes, there is at the very least something wrong. I would say there are quite a few things going wrong. I don't want to get stuck on this for too long. It seems to me like making it about sort of larger, implacable, sort of deeply abstract economic factors like lower wages, which I do and have done. And I'm not trying to hit you too hard on this one. But it seems like on the one hand, that's putting it on the side of the public when what's going on here is the government is choosing to respond to these events seriously in some ways. And I can't even kind of blame them. But even that, the economic decisions, as far as I can tell, are intentional. Coming to the topic of lifespan for a second. Lifespan, throughout the vast majority of the history of the United States, has just gone up. People have been expected to live longer and longer the further into the trajectory of this country that you get. It's only within the last 10, 12 years that lifespan starts to go down, where we've had, year after year drops in lifespan at this point. And that started during austerity in 2009, 2010. Same thing with infrastructure investment. If you look at the holes in our bridges and the potholes on our roads and just the problems with American infrastructure, particularly when you compare it with a slightly more developed country like China, for instance, what you'll see is the drop in investment in infrastructure also happened 2009, 2010, with this sort of hidden austerity as we switched into quantitative easing mode and propping up Wall Street as the financial crisis hit, the Great Recession, whatever you want to call it. That seems like an intentional decision. And those are certainly economic factors, but those are driven by the decisions of key policymakers. And I'm not saying you don't know that or you necessarily disagree with it. I don't know. I just like to put the fire on the leaders or something like that. And I think you do too.
Oh, yeah, but it's not that straightforward.
It's disgusting.
No, I feel you, but it's not that straightforward. It's not that the leaders are in a glass vase that are separate and distinct from the community to which they operate. It's not that. Those leaders are also functioning in the context of a system. And all the incentives and everything else are built for them to do what they do. I mean, don't get me wrong. I would want them to be better people. I would want them to act differently in the context of the system to which they're operating in. But that doesn't seem to be the way it's operated. I mean, even the FDR era was a blip. That was a fluke. That wasn't, the left always looks back to it and says, hey, and Democrats, even in the language that they use, they talk about it in an FDR sense. It was a fluke. It was a blip. It was an oddity in what is typically inexorably a raping of the society. And so I feel you in saying I wish the leaders would be better people, but what system incentivizes those leaders to be a better people? It's not ours.
Ideally, we would directly, and ideally they'd have their own sort of whatever it is within their own caste, within their own political class at the upper echelons of our society. They would convince each other and incentivize each other to do what's best for the American public, because that is at least ostensibly their role. But I don't think that this is characteristic. I think we're seeing an unusual and unprecedented decline in the quality of our media. I think that on the one hand, how powerful our government is, and on the other, how ineffectual it has grown, mean that at some point we're going to see a very large bang and a catastrophe for our country, the likes of which we haven't seen.
That I agree with you.
In that sense, I think we're living in unprecedented times.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So because it's unprecedented, I think that we're going to see some unprecedented stuff happen. For the worse, certainly, and really desperately hope against all hopes for the better at some point. We're going to see some turnaround, some magnificent, if we can get some people. If people are willing to come in from the wings, stage center, and sort of whisk us away to some better way of doing things. If we can get some leaders in here is what I'm saying. That would be great. Anyway, we've got more headlines and only so much time for them. Former Vice President Walter Mondale has passed away, served from 77 to 81, 1977 to 1981, under President Jimmy Carter. He was 93 at the time that he passed. The chief medical examiner for Washington has found that Officer Brian Sitnick's death was natural and not caused by a breach of the Capitol. Sitnick died from strokes. This comes after a series of theories about how he died. First, that he was bludgeoned to death by being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher. Next, that he was sprayed with bear spray. That's why bear spray, not usually deadly, not usually a mortal force, but that he was sprayed by bear spray and he was allergic to it or something, and that he died from that. Well, apparently, no. These were natural causes. It seems like the results could have come out sooner. But, 3 months on, more than that, 3.5 months on at this point, he has been useful as an example of the terrible force of the Capitol protesters back on January 6th, despite him being the only person they would have killed. And now the fact that they, didn't kill anybody, I don't know. Oh, God.
Shane,
the whole set of events.
Shane, excuse me. I need to interrupt right now. I am going to stay with the belief that I was told by media, because media never gets it wrong, that Sitnick was beaten to death by a fire extinguisher with a bunch of people screaming Trump in his last few moments. Meaning the last moment of his life, he screams Trump, Trump, Trump as he's beaten to death by a fire extinguisher. That's what mainstream media told me, and so that's what I am going to run with. That's where I'm at.
And after all hail media, Jamarl.
Right.
Just say it with me.
Right.
Let's praise the media in the United States. They do such good jobs. Oh, I'm just kidding. I want to get at least one or two more of these headlines. No, the media is disgusting. Vice President Harris has said her role in responding to the migrant crisis is a, quote, diplomatic focus on the Northern Triangle. It is about bringing together, as I did now, I think a couple of weeks ago, the members of the cabinet, end quote, specifically from the Departments of Commerce and Agriculture, also saying that she has asked Japan's Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga if he could help in the region. A quick reminder here, Vice President Harris is tasked with handling the crisis on the border. This comes as the White House, as far as I can tell, is pivoting from treating the crisis on the border, quote unquote, as the migrant crisis. That's how most Americans would be familiar with it, as a sort of diplomatic and political crisis in the Northern Triangle, which is the southern end of Mexico and the northern end of Central America, just Central America, effectively. We've switched to treating it as a diplomatic crisis, which I will point out conveniently gets the buck, off of us and onto these countries to our south. In other words, it shifts the whole process here. I understand they're looking at root causes. They're looking at, where these migrants are coming from. But if we don't see a crisis on our border, then the crisis is entirely in another country, which means it's not our crisis. And that's an absolutely great state of affairs if your role in the government is trying to not have to actually solve the problems you're faced with, but instead make them other people's problems and then kindly offer those other people your help. Anyway, this comes as White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki walked back a claim of President Biden's on Saturday when he said, the problem was that the refugee part was working on the crisis that ended up on the border with young people. And I repeat that. The problem was that the refugee part was working on the crisis that ended up on the border with young people, end quote. Interesting kind of convoluted phrasing there. Psaki said that Biden actually believes there is a crisis in Central America, saying this. Andre, let's play this clip real quick.
The president does not feel that children coming to our border seeking refuge from violence, economic hardships, and other dire circumstances is a crisis. He does feel that the crisis in Central America, the dire circumstances that many are fleeing from, that is a situation we need to spend our time, our effort on, and we need to address it if we're going to prevent more of an influx of migrants from coming in years to come.
So you can hear it there. And I want to close headlines here, but Jamarl, does this make sense? The idea is we thought that Vice President Harris was dealing with the migrant crisis on America's southern border. It turns out the problem isn't here. The problem is actually in the nations to our south. It's in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. That's why she's going on a diplomatic trip there. That's where the problem originates. That's where the problem has remained, apparently. We're just a little bit on the edge of the pool where the wave starts to lap up over the side. Really, the problem is in the center. It's in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. That's where she's preoccupying her attention. And that's where we should look if we want to cast blame, really, is these other countries full of brown people. Jamarl, does that make sense? I know we should close here, but real quickly.
It's warped. I mean, what Psaki is basically saying is there's not a crisis at the border. There's an issue at the border, the crisis in the other countries. What? Like,
exactly.
It's a word salad, and it's done, like, it's not even good propaganda. It's like, hey, is there a crisis at the border? No, we don't characterize it as a crisis. We characterize it as an issue because we want to we characterize it as compassion. However, it is a crisis in the other countries where people are leaving. Why are they leaving, Jen? Why are they leaving? And if it is a crisis in those countries, doesn't it also become a crisis when those people end up at our border? However you want to characterize it, it's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. It's
in some sense, I kind of agree. Of course, I agree with the idea. Okay, these other countries are having problems. A lot of the root causes are there, but a lot of the root causes are here too, with the whole cooing and overthrowing thing. And it's as if Psaki, when she's speaking to the media, when she's answering this way, is like subtly, come on, guys, catch up. Don't ask me about the crisis here. Start asking me about Guatemala, Honduras. I don't want to wink. I don't want to have to give you any weird side eye if you don't do it the right way, but come on, catch up. Stop asking me about this. Anyway, we got to close this. Those are headlines.
Real quick. You're right. And instead of this being an adversarial conversation, which it should be, I mean, you tell me, should this press conference be adversarial? Meaning when the media comes out, because this is not like PMQs, where PMQs, it's stressful. It's this person wants information, the other prime minister has it, and you rip it out of them because you know the prime minister is going to BS you. When the media comes in and Jen is like, oh, guys, how's it going? Oh, we're doing fine, Jen. Oh, look at the socks. Their socks are great today, and blah, 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 blah. It's not adversarial in the way that it should be. It's not trying to rip information out of the administration, assuming that she's going to lie and assuming she's going to, obfuscate. That's what she does. That should be the assumption, but that's not the way they interact with one another. They interact with one another as if they're just good buddies here for a conversation, And that is not the role of media. That is a failure of media. I agree with you 1,000%.
It is. Yes. And Jamarl, one last point. When's the last time you complimented me on my socks? I've got great socks, gosh darn it. Anyway, we need to close.
Well, if we were in office, I would do it every day.
Good to hear. I really appreciate that. I will demand it, in fact. Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines. We're going into a break. We will be back with the soapbox segment, Jamarl's monologue, and our back and forth. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Yo! So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now, the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you guys want to join in on the conversation, you could do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We ran a little bit over on the headline, so I'm going to try to keep this quick, and I'm going to try to snapshot it. The case, Derek Chauvin, that trial is basically coming to an end. The defense and the prosecution has given their closing statements. The judge has given the instructions, and at this point, the jury is out. Now, I would like to ensure or hope or push to you that you disabuse yourself of the idea that Chauvin is a bad apple. A lot of the arguments that took place boiled around this idea of what would a reasonable cop do. And it's an obvious question. It's the question that I pose, and when I make the argument, or when I frame the argument in the context of if it was a doctor, if it was a lawyer, if it was a software engineer, what would be the reasonable expectations of that individual as they pursue their jobs? And under normal circumstances, most things, the overwhelming majority of the time, will function as normal. And the cop, the engineer, the doctor will have a certain expectation of skill and performance, even in the context of normality. But that expectation doesn't go away when the difficulty comes in. That expectation is still there. How that person, how that cop, how that doctor, how that lawyer, or whoever deals with adversity, they're being judged by that. And there's an expectation of skill and competence, even in the context of adversity. I'm on a traffic stop. Great. What would a reasonable cop do in that traffic stop? What would a reasonable cop do when the traffic stop is going normal? Person comes up, I give the person a ticket, I wag my finger at him, I say, son, you need to be more careful when you're driving, and the person drives off. Reasonable expectation. A cop pulls out his gun and shoots the guy. That is unreasonable. No cop would expect that. No cop would be okay with that, especially if the suspect is just sitting in his car doing nothing. It would be an unreasonable standard. What happens, though, if the suspect tries to run? There's still a question of what's reasonable. And what's reasonable on some level is defined by the society and on some level even defined by the culture itself. Meaning, if the individual is trying to run and the cop shoots and kills the individual, there is a certain standard of reasonableness and expectation in the context of the cop having a difficult time doing that job. That would be true if it was a doctor that engaged a patient that ended up being a bleeder doing the surgery or had weird anatomy doing the surgery. Just because the doctor encounters a problem doesn't absolve the doctor of blame or fault if the patient dies and if the doctor had something to do with the patient dying, especially if there was a reasonable expectation that the doctor should have been able to handle the case or should have been expected to function on the basic level of competence, which would have kept that person alive. The same thing is true in this case. The catch here, though, and I think what the defense does get right, even though it's not entirely going to matter, is that this is not a bad apple. This is a rotten bunch. This idea of what's reasonable is fair enough as a standard. The catch becomes what's reasonable and what's accepted is often deplorable in and of itself. The other cops that were around Chauvin didn't think Chauvin was doing anything wrong. And that is indicative of normal policing, meaning they thought Chauvin was just doing a regular job. They didn't see anything weird or odd in the way that Chauvin was operating. And if there's anything in this case that should scare you, bug you, or concern you, it's that. Those 4 officers just saw Chauvin doing what Chauvin would typically do every day of the week that he's on the force. And what they would do every day of the week when they're on the force. Therefore, but go the grace of God go I would imagine many of the cops are saying it in this very specific case. Let's hear the prosecution make their case about the reasonableness, because the prosecution is right here. Let's play the clip.
He betrayed the badge and everything it stood for. It's not how they're trained. It's not following the rules. This is not an anti-police prosecution. It's a pro-police prosecution. You saw the photo. You saw the body language. You can learn a lot about someone by looking at their body language. The defendant facing down that crowd. They were pointing cameras at him, recording him, telling him what to do, challenging his authority, his ego, his pride. Not the kind of pride that makes you do better, be better. The kind of ego-based pride. But the defendant was not going to be told what to do. He was not going to let these bystanders tell him what to do. He was going to do what he wanted, how he wanted, for as long as he wanted. And there was nothing they could do about it.
Let's stop right there for a moment. That's normal. That's normal. Cops typically have authority issues. And so the idea that Chauvin was there being unempathetic, that is the most normal thing in the world. And yet, the prosecution is going to make it seem like this is an abnormal case. This is a bizarre case. This is not typical policing. I would like to disabuse you of that. It is true that these guys are going to cut bait, but don't fall for this idea that they're trying to preserve a nanoparticulate of virtue or some mangled issue of virtue. No, this is more like the guilty husband thoroughly distancing himself from the friend that just so happened to get caught cheating on the wife. Theatrical, loud, boisterous. Oh, I would never do that. I can't believe he did that. How dare he did that? That is horrible, horrible. I would never do that. I would never do that to you. I love you. I love you. That's what this is. This is the loud proclamation of something that they themselves are also guilty of. And honestly, defense in this case doesn't entirely make sense, even though what the defense is trying to argue is he didn't do anything abnormal. And unfortunately for the defense, the prosecution, other cops, is never going to own up to that. Shane, we only have about a minute and a half, but what are your thoughts? I think he's guilty of sin, and I think he's going to be convicted. And like I said, I don't think the defense entirely makes sense. It is a reasonable standard is what they're going for. And I don't think anybody could say that what Chauvin did was reasonable, and that's their problem.
I hear you, but what I'm worried about is that we have rising rates of homicides. Our society is breaking down in a lot of really important ways, and you don't want police to push back too hard, whatever that means. But on the other hand, if the rate of crime is going up, the rate of homicides and robberies and rapes is going up, what do you do in response to that? Is it defunding the police, which was in vogue as an idea last summer before it was kind of quickly shot down from a bunch of different angles. If you're seriously reconsidering, like, if you want to reform the police, okay, that's a larger operation and I'm open to hearing it. But on the other hand, if you're going to try to do that, that is at least temporarily going to dramatically slow down the ability of the police to respond to crime, because you're reforming it. You're going through some sort of long-term overhaul process. And with homicides suddenly spiking to a rate that we haven't seen in 20 plus years, I feel like the cultural consensus might be pushing a little bit too far in the other direction. And I'm worried that we're gonna see the other side of this. I'm worried that we're going to see harsher leadership. We're going to see harsher policing. We're going to see all those things. And it's just going to deepen the divide because we're not actually fundamentally addressing the problem, which is, yes, police are guilty of brutality sometimes, but also crime is rising. And who else do you turn to stop it? I don't want the military stepping in. We need to close here. This is definitely a topic we're going to pick back up later on in the show. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we will be back on the other side in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So, Turkey purchased the Russian S-400 air defense system. Now, Turkey is a sovereign nation. However, Turkey is also part of NATO. And whether this is an economic issue or whether this is a geopolitical issue, the United States had certain feelings about Turkey doing that and passed sanctions on a NATO partner because of such. Right here, the Secretary of State has, quote, the Secretary of State has determined, pursuant to the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act of 2017, that the Turkish entity Presidency of Defense Industries, formerly known as Undersecretariat for Defense Industries, has knowingly, on or after August 2nd, 2017, engaged in a significant transaction with a person that is part of or operates for, on behalf of, the defense or intelligence sector of the government of the Russian Federation. This statement added that the Secretary of State has also selected certain sanctions to be imposed upon the SSB and Ismail Demir, the SSB president's Frank's Jugend. Basically, without going too far into the weeds, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Turkey for buying the S-400 missiles. And there's also this interesting question of Turkey, being a NATO member, buying those missiles in the first place. To discuss, we're having a conversation, to have a conversation about it. We're discussing this with Yusuf Aram. He's editor-at-large at TRT World and a Turkish foreign policy expert. Yusuf, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, explain this for me from the standpoint of Turkey and the framing of the Turkish government in regards to two things. Buying the S-400 missiles in the first place, which again, Turkey is a sovereign country, it can do whatever it wants. But it is interesting that a NATO nation is buying a sophisticated weapon system from Russia. So there's that part. But also, how does Turkey frame or deal with, from their standpoint, and the way that they think about this, the sanctions passed on them from the United States?
Well, it's very simple. Now, when we look at what's happened over the past decade in Turkey's neighborhood, you have the Syrian conflict, you have the Iraq conflict, you have ISIS on Turkey's borders, you have PKK, which is a Kurdish designated terror group on Turkey's borders. You have over 700 missiles which have landed on, I should say rockets, which have landed on Turkish soil over the past 10 years. Now, in 2015, the United States withdrew their Patriots from Turkey, and many of Turkey's NATO allies have also withdrawn their Patriots from Turkey as their service time had expired. So Turkey realized that it can't just count on NATO for its air defense. It needs its own air defense system that it personally owns. It tried to buy Patriots from the United States during the Obama era. That never panned out. The conditions just were not feasible. There was no technology transfer, and Turkey didn't feel confident that Congress would have approved such a sale. As over the past 2 to 3 years, we've seen that there's been a shadow ban on any type of Turkish purchase of weapons from the United States. So Turkey went first to China. The Chinese deal fell through, and afterwards, Turkey ended up reaching a deal with Russia. So it was a very logical step, a very logical chronology, a very rational chronology that led Turkey to buy the S-400. Now, as for the sanctions, well, first, Turkey has told the United States that this is going to be a standalone system. It's not going to interfere with NATO's radar, any type of NATO equipment. That's something that the United States didn't agree on. They felt that the F-35, the multi-role fighter jet that Turkey's not only a partner in, it's also a manufacturer and a customer in. They felt that its stealth technology was going to be at risk to the Russians due to the S-400's very sophisticated radar system. That's an issue that's up for debate. Turkey has offered to create a technical working group with U.S. officials to study the relationship between both of these very sophisticated weapons. Americans have declined. And at the end of the day, the United States first withdrew Turkey from the F-35 program. Now, as a punishment, that is understandable. You might not want to put your weapon at risk, and it's understandable. But the United States went even farther and sanctioned Turkey under CATSA, which is Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions and Tariffs Act. And Turkey, the Turkish Defense Industry Secretariat has been under sanctions now, I believe, for a couple months due to this acquisition of the S-400. This is something that Turkey does not understand because Turkey has given many guarantees to the United States that its weapons wouldn't be under threat and that this is a defensive weapon. This is not an offensive weapon. And why would you sanction a NATO ally when you're trying to counter Russia supposedly with this act? Was this act made to counter or legislated to counter Russia and China, or was this act legislated to counter NATO allies or punish NATO allies? And it's not only Turkey that's going to be facing sanctions under this act. It looks like the Indians very, very soon due to their S-400 purchase.
Yeah, they are.
The Egyptians as well due to their purchase of Russian warplanes. And quite possibly Germany or the Nord Stream 2 pipeline might be sanctioned, which is very important for Germany and Europe's energy security as well. So we're seeing this CATSA bill.
Economic? Like, do you think that this is like the foreign policy aspect is being used as an excuse, and they just don't want people purchasing either the products from China, either the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in regards to this kind of economic boon, or the S-400 missiles? Because it seems like the S-400 missiles is just a good weapon system. And that from the standpoint of, let's say, selling items, be it armaments or the weapon systems, that the U.S., we just don't want other countries purchasing it. Meaning we're using a foreign policy as an excuse to get involved in economic choices.
Well, it's definitely economics. And when you look at America's strategy to counter the other two superpowers of the world, whether it be trade wars with China or sanctions on China or sanctions on Russia or Russian assets or Russian military sales, Russian energy sales, they're trying to counter these two superpowers by using economic sanctions as their main instrument, as their main geopolitical instrument to keep that military tension low, but keep the pressure high. We're also seeing the United States do this to Iran as well, especially under the Trump administration when there was a maximum pressure campaign. So definitely economics is very, very important. And when you look at CATSA, it completely goes against the World Trade Organization. It goes against the principles of the capitalist system, which is competition. If you can't compete, you cannot create these superficial boundaries, these superficial restrictions to halt competition. This is unethical. This is against the capitalist mentality, a mentality that the United States has embraced now for over 2 centuries to compete with these countries. If it's not, either create a better anti-air defense system or create better conditions to sell this system. And if you can't, well, someone's doing it better than you. It's not, the United States can't be the best at everything. Obviously, other countries are going to excel at different aspects in different fields in different sectors. So I do believe that this is definitely economic, and that America is trying to economically cage in countries that it views that as rivals or could be rivals in the coming years.
Well, it's Yusuf. Thank you for joining us. This is Shane here. I'm curious, kind of spinning from that for a second. We were talking geoeconomics and even geopolitics there, of course. How does Turkey view its neighbors? Who does it see itself allying with here? How does it view within the European Union and the European Union as a bloc? Clearly conflict with the Kurds. So relations with Syria are not exactly in the best state right now. Israel, Russia, Iran, it's more significant neighbors geopolitically and geoeconomically. How does it view them, and how does it view itself in this set of relationships, in this web of relationships tying Europe and Asia together? Yusuf.
Look, when you look at the geopolitical trends right now, whether it be rhetoric coming out of the continent of Europe, strategic autonomy, we hear that buzzword a lot. In Turkey, we hear independent foreign policy a lot. And from a Western perspective, when you hear Turkey say independent foreign policy and you see Turkey centering its foreign policy, it looks as if it's shifting east. It's not. It's taking into account the multipolar realities of the world. It's not the old world order anymore. It's not the post-Soviet Union order, 30 years of U.S. dominance. That era is coming to an end. Unfortunately, many people in Washington fail to realize this. And the longer they fail to realize this and recalibrate their foreign policy, the tougher it's going to be to have a reset and a rethink going forward. But many countries, whether it be the European continent or Turkey or in the MENA region, are seeing Russia and China growing and are trying to quickly diversify their foreign policy portfolios to create mutual beneficial interests with Beijing and Moscow as well. So this isn't any surprise. And Turkey right now is trying to center itself. It has good relations with Russia. At times, there's a lot of cooperation. At times, there's a lot of competition, because you have to realize that both of these countries project power in many of the same neighborhoods. So bilaterally, everything's very good. But from a foreign policy aspect, when we look at different international theaters, whether it be Syria, Libya, Iraq, Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan region, these are all areas that Turkey and Russia compete. But that competition is mainly on a proxy level, so it's manageable when it comes to foreign policy. And Putin and Erdogan have a very strong relationship. They spoke with each other just 20 times last year. That's the most bilateral correspondence amongst any 2 world leaders in the world. So it's understandable that there's strong lines of communications between Ankara and Moscow. Same thing with China. Turkey's trying to increase its relationship with China over the past couple of years as well. Now, this, as I said, this isn't a shift east. Turkey's not reviewing its NATO membership or anything. It's not leaving NATO. These are all things that are ingrained in Turkey's DNA. You don't turn your back on a 7-decade relationship, but that doesn't mean that you don't take into account the changing global realities, which is a multipolar world. And it looks like for the next 5 decades, maybe the next century, it's going to be a multipolar world until something changes. So Turkey is going to continue to center its foreign policy. And many countries are doing this. We're seeing France do this. We're seeing Germany do this. We're seeing much of the European Union do this as well.
I know, absolutely. And like you're saying, there is a sort of tectonic shift in the nature of how countries view their roles and their alliances. And it is towards more independence, by and large. We need to go to a break in a couple of minutes here. You brought up Nagorno-Karabakh. I think it's just like you said that I believe the phrase was that Russia and Turkey were competing. Turkey was backing Azerbaijan. Russia was trying to maintain some degree of independence, from what I can tell. It's not as if they were throwing their lot in with the Armenian side. They were, sort of cautiously trying to work that disagreement out. And it has worked out. It has been worked out. There is now a short but lasting peace between the two countries. I want to turn for a minute to a country that we haven't brought up yet, Ukraine. Like you said, Erdogan and Putin have had a number of meetings, but on the issue of Ukraine, it seems that Erdogan has come down on the side of Zelensky, of the rest of NATO, against Russia. We need to go to a break in a minute here, but briefly, Yusuf, how do you see Ukraine? How do you think Erdogan sees Ukraine? Do you see that as a conflict with Russia? Do you think that's going to get worse? What do you see Turkey's role in Ukraine being, Yusuf?
I think the last thing Erdogan wants to see is any type of kinetic engagement between Ukraine and Russia and any type of destabilization of that region. The stability of that region is important. Erdogan has a very important interest with Zelensky, very important interest with Putin. And the last thing he wants to do is be put in a position where he really needs to choose. Is he on the Ukrainian side? Currently, rhetorically, he is on the Ukrainian side. But would Erdogan back Ukraine militarily against Russia? I highly doubt it. Would Turkey take part in some type of NATO coalition, some NATO coalition that has wide participation? That might be an option where Turkey might support Ukraine, but it would only be under the umbrella of NATO. It would not be Turkey and the Ukraine versus Russia in any scenario. I don't see Erdogan putting himself out on a limb, and I don't see him putting Turkey against Russia in that aspect. But as I said, under the umbrella of NATO with wide participation from NATO member states, yes, Turkey would most likely fulfill its NATO mandate if called upon, and as it has in the past. And as I said before, in Turkey's strategy, it's always engaged Russia militarily only on a proxy level, where it's Russian proxies and Turkish proxies engaging, never direct confrontation. And it would continue that strategy in the Ukraine under the umbrella of NATO.
You know what? We got to go to a break. Thank you for that. We're going to be back with Yusuf in a minute. For those listening, that is the voice of Yusuf Erim, editor-at-large at TRT World and Turkish foreign policy expert. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to a break, but we will be back with Yusuf in just a minute. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined by Yusuf Erim. He is, for those listening, the editor-at-large and editor-at-large at TRT World and Turkish foreign policy expert. Yusuf, thank you again for sticking with us. I want to follow up. We're going to get back into Ukraine here shortly, I'm sure, but on NATO and on Turkey's role in NATO, the largest member nation on that side of the Atlantic in NATO. And like you said, Turkey is simultaneously pursuing more independent foreign policy, as are many other nations in the region and around the world. And yet that inevitably sets them up for some tension between their NATO membership and their own foreign policy agenda. In Syria, the battle lines or the lines of conflict are flexible and vague and sort of shifting enough that hasn't seemed to be an issue. And it is, after all, a proxy conflict. As you said, Turkey is set up to fight with Russia or other nations if NATO decides to throw its lot in on these other conflicts. But it seems like this is setting Turkey up and NATO up for a long-term conflict as individual member states choose to sort of steer their own way militarily and economically. And as Turkey does so too. How do you see that playing out? What do you see Erdogan's role being? And how do you see Turkey's trajectory militarily when it comes to the NATO membership and its own ambitions? Yusuf.
Well, NATO's at a crossroads right now. It's still underneath the Cold War doctrine. It's still being managed as if there was a Cold War, but it needs to take into account the interests and needs of its members. Now, one of the smartest parts of Russian foreign policy, when we look at it, is the way it has engaged NATO members, most namely Germany, France, and Turkey. Now, when we think about NATO, when we think about NATO's military might, you think about 5 countries in reality. You think about the United States and England, and in the EU, France, Germany, and also Turkey. These are the 5 major militaries of NATO. Of course, there's other countries that contribute as well, but none more than these 5. And Moscow's done very smart and very wise foreign policy and been able to engage Germany, France, and Turkey. And by engaging them, they have made them very hesitant on some NATO policies that are directly confronting Russia. And also, like I said, we need to take into account the changing multipolar world right now. France does not want to engage Russia militarily. Neither does Turkey, neither does Germany. So is NATO just an instrument for U.S. and U.K. foreign policy? If it's not, what should be the new mandate of NATO? And I think that's a discussion that was first raised when Macron, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, called NATO brain dead. And it should have been raised at that summit in December in London at the NATO summit. It wasn't really talked about. So we have to empathize with other countries. Now, from a Russian perspective, you see NATO creeping every year closer and closer to its borders. So obviously it's going to be a national security threat to the Russians. And this is understandable. This needs to be understood by Washington. So if you're going to contain Russia, if that's your mandate, you have to understand that you need to have this type of containment without heightened tensions. NATO's borders are already very strong. They already contain most of the Baltic states, most of Eastern Europe as well. Adding the Ukraine to NATO, adding Georgia to NATO, having an increased presence in the Black Sea is going to be viewed as a national security threat. It's only going to escalate tensions. And of course, NATO needs to take into account migration from the Middle East, especially with this destabilization in Syria, Iraq, and possible destabilization in the future, and the security in the Eastern Mediterranean. These are all new threats that were not thought about when NATO was being formed, but NATO needs to evolve with the changing geopolitical needs. Now, as for Turkey's military, Turkey's continuing to localize its manufacturing. Now, I believe Turkey's local manufacturing meets about 70% of Turkey's military needs now, when compared to about 25% a decade or two ago. And I think the capacity of Turkish drones now is very well known, what they've done in Nagorno-Karabakh, Libya, and Syria. I don't think I need to go over that. And Turkey's continuing to invest in its local manufacturing because it wants to wean off its dependency on foreign weapons. I don't think it trusts foreign countries to be able to buy weapons from them and have a continuation of supply of spare parts as well. We've seen Canada stop selling the optics for some of these drones, but it didn't really bother Turkey because Turkey during this time was able to prepare its own optics for its drones as well. And it's going to continue. It's going to continue to project its power in North Africa. It's going to continue to project its power in the Middle East. And it's going to continue all these policies regardless of what's going on with NATO.
That's the interesting question. And because you clearly understand, like, this notion that NATO is encroaching closer and closer on Russian borders. And in the context of that, any country would take issue with encroachment on their borders, especially if you have an organization that was set, that supposedly for the Soviet Union goes bust, and the organization stays and continues to creep on the borders. I mean, it just comes across as this is a tool for geopolitical, I don't know what you want to call it, adventurism of sorts, as opposed to a tool of defense. And, you know, like you said, this gets kind of worse the more that you add on to it. And if you're going to make the argument that we're going to continue to gobble up countries, and if any of those countries are attacked, all of those countries respond, but we're also going to get closer and closer to the border of Russia as we do that. That is greatly problematic. I mean, do you see NATO as
you know what that's going to do?
Go for it.
It's going to fracture the world into an East and West camp. When you have this type of military buildup from the West, every action has a counter reaction. And the counter reaction to this type of military buildup in the West is going to be a military buildup in the East. And we're slowly seeing more and more Eastern organizations being formed. Shanghai Cooperation Council, ASEAN, and other types of organizations. While most of these organizations right now are economic cooperation, that doesn't mean in the future these economic cooperation cannot expand to include military cooperation as well. So this type of buildup is just going to create a backlash. And we've seen this throughout history. And I think the last thing the world needs right now is an Eastern Bloc versus a Western Bloc. Because now with the rise of China, this won't look like the Cold. Won't look like the Cold War. This will be like the Cold War on steroids. Yeah. Because you're going to have a Sino-Russian coalition. A multitude of countries are going to join them. You have the yuan becoming a very predominant currency in the world. Probably in the next 10 to 20 years, it's going to be globally accepted just as much as the U.S. dollar. So you're going to have these currency wars. You're not going to have a U.S. dollar-dominated system. You're going to have Russian weapons proliferated throughout the East. So you're going to have something that looks like an Eastern version of NATO if this type of aggression and if this type of raising of tensions continues.
Where does Turkey fall on that?
The engagement.
Where's Turkey?
Yeah, what's Turkey's disposition there?
Yeah, where's Turkey in that? I'm fascinated by that because right now
that would put Turkey in a very precarious place. Turkey in a very precarious place, and I don't know what Turkey's position would be because what I was just saying is 10 to 20 years down the line, and Turkey right now is in a very, very slippery neighborhood. When I mean slippery neighborhood, the geopolitics of this region are changing so quickly. I mean, 10 years ago, could anyone imagine Turkey and Russia cooperating on this level? No. Could anyone imagine Turkey having serious problems with NATO? No. Can anyone imagine Turkey launching expeditionary forces 2,000 kilometers away? They didn't have that capacity, but now they have that capacity in Libya. So a lot has changed over the last 10 years, and I'm sure a lot more is going to change over the next 10 years. So it's really foggy to be able to call what's going to happen a decade down the line.
Well, we only have a couple minutes here. I want to get to Turkey's state going forward, and I'm speaking economically. The value of the Turkish lira is, at least in the second lira, at all-time lows, with the exchange rate compared to the American dollar having dropped like something from every 8 Turkish liras would be equivalent to 10 American dollars. Pardon me, the other way around. Every 12, something like 12, 13 Turkish liras equivalent to 10 American dollars. Absolute shambles. A 0.83 exchange rate effectively over the last 13 years, dropping down to a 0.12, 0.13. The number jumps around every once in a while. But at least in terms of the state of that currency, which is reflective on a deeper level of the state of the economy, things aren't going well. What's Erdogan's position on that? How do you see the Turkish economy changing? What do you see that being caused by? And what could potentially fix that from the Turkish side? Yusuf?
That's a lot of questions there. Let's start with what caused it. Well, first of all, obviously, COVID's had a huge impact on all the global economies. Over the last 3 years, Turkey's been sanctioned twice by the United States. Both have resulted in serious foreign currency hikes. I believe during the sanctions for Pastor Brunson, which was, I believe, 2018 August, the Turkish lira was at 8.5 Turkish liras to a dollar. It had recovered all the way back to 6.9 Turkish liras to a dollar up to like 2 months ago. The central bank governor got sacked, and the previous central bank governor was very well liked by the market. So they didn't take too kindly upon the new appointment. So that created an influx. And also, again, with the CATSA sanctions, that created another sell-off in the Turkish lira as well. So when we look at the economic indicators of Turkey, they're not that bad. They don't warrant such a weak Turkish lira. Obviously, the weak Turkish lira does have some benefits to exports. It's much easier for Turkey to export its goods because of its currency is very soft right now. But of course, then you have price stability problems.
1 minute.
Inflation, which isn't good, which affects much of the population. And the economy, which has always been Erdogan's strong suit, before elections, is right now his weak underbelly. So it's definitely a priority for Erdogan to get the economy back. And he's been preparing some economic reform packages, and he does want to get the economy back on track before elections in 2023. So you have elections down the road about 1.5 to 2 years from now. And that's something that he's definitely keyed on.
30.
Definitely right now is top priority, getting the economy going. But also, obviously, solving the COVID problem is very, very important because you can't get the economy going when the country's under lockdown as well. So
absolutely.
It's kind of
I hear you.
scenario right now.
It is. No, and a lot of countries are facing that, of course. Yusuf, thank you for joining us. Great conversation. Really appreciate you being with us. Yusuf Aram, editor-at-large at TRT World and Turkish foreign policy expert. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours this morning. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That will strongly imply that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Great guest on the last segment, Yusuf. Great guest. When I reached out to him, I was he hit me back quite readily. And it ended up being a really good conversation. Sometimes you don't know when you bring on a new guest. And sometimes you are wildly surprised at how good they are. So shout out to Yusuf. Thank you for joining us, man. We will glad to have you back in the coming future. But let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 483 new coronavirus deaths and 70,355 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 67,175 cases per day, an increase of 4% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Monday evening, more than 31,761,200 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 567,200 have died from it. 567,200 Americans dropped dead over the course of a year from a virus. Put that in perspective. That is astonishing. In all of the United States, in Washington, D.C., and in Puerto Rico, vaccines are now available to all adults. This comes as upwards of half of the American public has received at least one vaccine shot. This comes after President Biden set a goal of administering 200 million doses by his 100th day in office, which the nation seems set to meet. I have my one shot. I think my wife has one shot. My mom has one shot. I think Shane has one shot. So I suppose that all of us are in on this. The CDC is meeting this Friday to evaluate adverse effects from the Johnson & Johnson shot, saying it, quote, hasn't been an overwhelming number of cases, but what we're looking and seeing what's coming in, or what's come in, unquote. Fauci has said he expects a warning will be added to the shot, but it would still be available for use. And this is the one where Shane says, yeah, this is somewhat of a reasonable way of going about it. The AstraZeneca vaccine, if you remember, that became a huge issue of contention when a blood clot, a rare blood clot, was basically a concern of many of the medical industry. Now, in the U.S., we brought on Dr. Kogan, and Kogan said, yeah, I think it's the right choice. You must let the public know, especially for something like this that's rare, and when we don't necessarily understand the mechanism by which it operates, yes, you need to put a warning on it, and yeah, you need to pause it in order to get your arms around it. Now, the catch that Shane made strongly was that if you are in Europe, and you're in, say, somewhere like, I don't know, Germany, and you have like 10% of the population that's been inoculated, well, if you don't have a luxury of options because you have geopolitical issues of getting the Russian vaccine or the Chinese vaccine, and AstraZeneca is all you got, how can you put the kibosh on the only thing that you got when the number of deaths that the vaccine will cause, in comparison to the number of deaths that the virus will cause, not even close. And yet that seemed to be the tack that Europe took. So the U.S. seems to be taking much more of a different tact on this. By the same token, the U.S. has a luxury of options in regards to the vaccine. When my mom went, I think they asked her, which one do you want? Meaning she even had the option. So, yeah, we have far more options that Europe does not have in regards to what vaccines we use and what vaccines we don't. And the AstraZeneca one became a big point of contention. The Johnson & Johnson one, not as much. The country of India on Monday registered 273,810 new infections and 1,619 new deaths, with the state government announcing yesterday that vaccines will be available to all adults the start of next month. Now, keep in mind, that number is high, but India has like 3 or 4 times a population. So the comparison that you would probably give is per capita. That said, that number is still monstrous, despite them having over 1 billion people. Yesterday, the prosecution and defense gave their closing arguments in the trial of Derek Chauvin over the killing of George Floyd, and now the jury has gone into deliberations, a process that could take just a few days or longer. The defense asked Judge Peter Cahill to rule a mistrial following the words of California Congressman Maxine Waters, which the judge denied, although he cautioned that Maxine Waters' comments could, quote, give the defense room to appeal the verdict of the trial. Waters has called on protesters to become more confrontational nights after dozens were arrested in by Brooklyn Center Police. Barbed wire and armed soldiers are currently set up around Minneapolis courtroom, and Minneapolis governor has activated 125 National Guard to support Minneapolis police in preparation for the delivery of the verdict. They know what I know. With the lack of accountability in the context of the law. Meaning, keep in mind, the law, part of it, is not just there for the look of it or for the theatrics of it. There's a logical basis to law dealing with accountability. You don't want Batmans or vigilantes in your society doing what it seems that the law can't necessarily do in the context of holding criminals accountable. No, the law, in part, is there for people to understand that they are equal under the context of that law. That's the whole justice is blind thing. And that should be blind whether it's a cop or whether it's a random person in the street being pulled over by that cop. In the context of a system where cops are able to act with impunity and there is no consequence, then law breaks down. The accountability aspect of law breaks down. And mechanically speaking, the society itself starts to take matters into its own hands, which is just going to end up in chaos. There's a logical faculty to law in holding the elements accountable, even when those people are part and parcel to the functions of that law itself. It's important. It's not just theatrics. Former Vice President Walter Mondale has passed away. Mondale served from 77 to 81 under President Jimmy Carter. He died at the age of 93. The medical examiner in Washington has found that Officer Brian Sicknick's death was natural, and not caused by a breach of the Capitol. Sicknick died from stroke. This comes after a lot of talk about Sicknick being killed by a fire extinguisher and Trump supporters screaming, Trump, Trump, Trump. I have this image in my head of the sad, sad state of affairs where Trump is law and order. We believe in law and order. We believe in law and order. And his supporters, we believe in law and order. We believe in law and order. Especially if it's putting down some black kid. But in the context of them believing in that law and order, we were told that when they raided the Capitol, Sicknick was standing there as he was pushing back the crowd, and the crowd overwhelmed Sicknick, and with flags, and with Trump banners and Trump hats, and with fire extinguisher. The last thing that Sicknick remembers, or Sicknick sees before he leaves this mortal coil, is being hit over and over again with a fire extinguisher, with people in the background screaming, Trump, Trump, Trump. That's pretty theatrical, and it didn't happen. And yet, that is what we were told on some level happened. Here's the catch. You would think that just like after the whole Russian thing, paying the Taliban was found to be ludicrous and farcical, that after that there would be some level of contrition. You would think that after getting 9/11 wrong, from the standpoint of Saddam Hussein, that there would be some level of contrition. You would think that after 3 years of the Russiagate stuff being found to be farcical, that you would have some issue of contrition. But no. Just like those other cases, in this, getting a sick nicks wrong, they just move on as if nothing happened, as if their failure didn't matter, and as if them seeding this into the public and the consequence that it had by seeding it into the public didn't matter. Their flaws, their failures, apparently just get ignored. Shane, this issue goes beyond just the misreporting or the poor reporting. It goes into how media has just gotten to the point where it's not even facts anymore. It doesn't even seem like facts is the point. It's what's the opinion, man? And the opinion, especially in the direction of people who you don't particularly like, Trump being one of those people, it just becomes theater. It becomes like a movie script that these guys write. This was completely wrong. And how do you get this that dramatically wrong? And then when you get it that dramatically wrong, how do you just move on from it? Especially if your job as media is to get it right. What are your thoughts? Because at a certain point, this is kind of like the cop thing, right? That if there's an expectation for a person to do their job in a basic level of competence, fair enough. And that's true for a doctor, that's true for a software engineer, that's true for a bricklayer. And if that construction worker or if that construction company builds a bridge and the bridge falls, and you find out that the materials were dodgy, that the things that they did when they built it was dodgy, that they should have known better, that a competent actor would have known how to do a basic level of due diligence to prevent that building from falling. When you know that, that guy's going to get sued and that person may get prosecuted. I'm making the point that within the context of the job that people do, there's a basic level of competence that's expected. People do make mistakes, fair enough. But again, it depends on what that mistake is. How do you get this that wrong? How do you get this that wrong? And it wasn't like this was on the moon. This was at the Capitol. You could talk to people. You could talk to the family. You could talk to the doctor. You could do all of that. But instead of doing any of that, what you ended up with was this farcical story of a man being beaten to death with a fire extinguisher. What are your thoughts?
You get that wrong when you have when you don't want to get it right. You get that wrong when you're existentially dependent on this dude being dead, on lying about this dude's death, because you need to sustain a narrative that the Capitol protests were deadly for anybody other than the protesters themselves, which right now it doesn't seem like they were. It seems like all of the people who died, two from heart conditions, one from amphetamine use, and then Ashley Babbitt from getting shot in the neck as she was trying to break into the building. All the people who've died from the Capitol are on the pro-Trump side of the aisle. And so you lie about this because you need to sustain the narrative that they killed cops, that they killed anybody other than themselves when they did this. It's that simple. You know exactly what I'm saying. And what Glenn Greenwald, great reporter, actually just recently, you and I were talking about this, I just recently watched Citizen 4, the documentary about Snowden, and he is like the most prominent person in that, more so than Snowden himself even. Documentary back, released 2014. Anyway, Glenn Greenwald, great journalist. He's been writing about this. And one of the things he'd been commenting on it. I haven't been the recipient of this myself. People were calling other people sicknick truthers if they questioned the narrative on how Officer Brian Sicknick died. In other words, there was this term that they used to make it look as if they were members of like a white nationalist conspiratorial network spreading disinformation and trying to lie about how Sicknick died. A big crowd of people online, including members of the media, were calling anybody who questioned the narrative Sicknick truthers. It reminds me of Russia bots. It reminds me of Putin's bots, or the claim that anybody who was questioning Russiagate just worked for the Kremlin. It's how you get people to shut up. And the media is so caught in this. It's like, I don't want to get into a big story, but it reminds me of like a mob wave made of molasses, where they're slow to pick up new information. Anything they do pick up sticks with them, and they just mindlessly roll forward and drown the public in in their own debris, in all of the loose accretions of facts and lies and all this stuff that make up the narrative that they want to have spread. Anyway, I've waxed poetic for a little bit too long about this, but that's how it works, is they want to lie about it because they need to sustain a narrative that they as a class are existentially dependent on.
Yes.
That's how it happened.
Yeah, and they don't want you to challenge that narrative. And it's far easier for them to just say, you're a Putin puppet, you're an Assad apologist, you're a sick truther, or whatever they want to call the people. It's far easier to say that and castigate the individuals in some kind of like around the conversation and to create a narrative. I mean, that's what takes place in politics, right? It's like you're running against Donald Trump. Politically, you want to create a headwind for people to vote for Trump. And so you say he's racist, he's sexist, he's bigoted, he's et cetera. And look, there may be some truth to those things, and there was some truth to those things. But the point of it is to create a headwind for people to vote for that person, or a headwind for people to even question whether or not the death was the way it happened, to question whether or not the story ended up the way it happened, meaning it's a way of putting a chill on people curiosity, on people even going into a second set of what could be a fact at this point, considering the way that media has been acting. Look at what they did with the Hunter Biden story. Was there any, our bad for getting that monstrously wrong? Was there any questioning on why they got it monstrously wrong? And the obvious answer is no. You had the AP come on and says, our bad. But at the end of the day, why was it your bad? Why did you get it wrong? And the honest truth of it, you got it wrong because you're trying to protect Biden. Media has its point of view, and within the context of the point of view, it promotes a narrative. They try to act like, oh, we're just objective arbiters. Nonsense. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like, share that audio or video. Also, make sure you're subscribed to whatever that platform is. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. The Chauvin trial has come to an end. And within the context of that trial coming to an end, I try to make the point to people that even though it seems like they're cutting bait, and what I mean by that, the prosecution was able to get, if I'm not mistaken, over 30 witnesses to make their case that this was indeed a murder. And basic argument, what would a reasonable cop do? And I think that's a fascinating question. Let's play the clip of the prosecution making their final arguments. Let's play the clip, Andre.
He betrayed the badge and everything it stood for. It's not how they're trained. It's not following the rules. This is not an anti-police prosecution. It's a pro-police prosecution. You saw the photo. You saw the body language. You can learn a lot about someone by looking at their body language. Defendant facing down that crowd. They were pointing cameras at him, recording him, telling him what to do, challenging his authority, his ego, his pride. Not the kind of pride that makes you do better, be better. The kind of ego-based pride. But the defendant was not going to be told what to do. He was not going to let these bystanders tell him what to do. He was going to do what he wanted, how he wanted, for as long as he wanted. And there was nothing they could do about it because he had the authority. He had the power of the badge and the other officers. And the bystanders were powerless. They were powerless to do a thing. The defendant, he chose pride over policing. Make no mistake, this is not a prosecution of the police. It is a prosecution of the defendant. And there's nothing worse for good police than a bad police who doesn't follow the rules, who doesn't follow procedure, who doesn't follow training, who ignores the policies of the department, the motto of the department, to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. He didn't follow training, those hundreds of hours of training that he had. He did not follow the department's use of force rules. He did not perform CPR. He knew better. He just didn't do better. You heard the trainer, Lieutenant Mercel. We don't train this. This is not who we are. What the defendant did was not policing. What the defendant did was an assault.
It's not who we are. What the defendant did was not policing. This is an assault. Policing is not on trial. Maybe policing should be on trial. Maybe policing should be on trial. Maybe what happened here wasn't a bad apple. Maybe maybe the botch is rotten. The fact that the other officers stood around and watched, why did they stand around and watch? Why didn't they see anything wrong? Why weren't they alerted to the problem? If Chauvin, out of the blue, just pulled out a gun and shot Floyd, just randomly when he first met him, each and every one of those officers would have had an issue with that. Why? Because it would have been so abnormal that they would have responded, whoa, 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 what are you doing? What are you doing? You can't do that. But what about this situation? They didn't do that. They were moseying around at some level. They helped. They saw nothing weird or odd about the situation at all, because from my assessment, there was nothing weird or odd taking place, short of the video cameras being present, short of the people in the crowd being greatly concerned, and short of it taking nearly 9 minutes to kill him. Nothing weird. And one more thing. Let's go to the defense also. Let's play the defenses. Or better yet, Shane, I'm going to get your take first before we go to the defense. What are your thoughts? I mean, the prosecution is trying to make a very strong case of this is not what a reasonable cop would have done. This is not what policing is. This is something else. And because it's something else, he broke the law.
Arguably, that's better for social perceptions of. Arguably, that does more to diminish the extent of civil unrest than saying this is policing. This is how a cop would act. You see it in person, which I'm sure is how a lot of people who come on the show, and part of what you've said and part of what other guests have said, I'm sure that's how a lot of people feel. This is how a cop acts. In fact, that is sort of the narrative, as far as I can tell, at least in the vocal portion of the left that's protesting this stuff, which is this is how police are by default. Police kill black people. They're racist to the bone. Like you're saying, it's not the apple that's rotten. It's the bunch. I don't know. I guess I just want to. I guess I want to try to push back on that.
Well, wait. I didn't say they were racist. I didn't use the term racist or anything like that. I think some are. Authority. Well, I do think some are, but I think they have authority issues more than anything else. I think the issue is authority. You're trespassing on my authority with a certain bias where when they see in themselves, meaning when they see somebody else that looks like them, it's not, this level of skepticism and doubt. It's a benefit of the doubt that they're willing to give, that I would wish that they just give that benefit of the doubt to everybody, regardless of the color and everything else. But I don't take the assessment that all of them are racist. I didn't even use that term.
No, I hear you. And yeah, that is something that I've heard some people say, and certainly plenty of people talk about institutional racism, which whether that's saying everybody in the institution is racist or not, levies like a tinge of racism and applies it to the whole bulk of the group. And the claim, even the thing that they have authority problems. I guess in a lot of cases, I wouldn't doubt that. It seems a little bit unanimous to say that it applies to literally everybody, or even to the vast majority, or even to the majority. It seems like that's a sort of ad hominem way of dismissing. I don't know. But does it apply more to police than it does to politicians? And is more ire being spared for politicians who kill millions while police kill 1,000 unjustly a year? Or is this just a politically levied move in American society supported by a lot of the Democrats and a lot of the left, when, frankly, we kill hundreds of thousands of people abroad every year and hardly anybody spares a tear for it? I mean, heck, if you wanted to have, this is now becoming me pushing back against the whole bulk of it, maybe to my own detriment here. But how many people have died from COVID at this point? I have to go back and check the headlines because for some reason my name is skipping the number.
567,200.
Exactly. That is coincidentally what I thought it was. 567,200. Okay, so police kill 1,000 people a year. America could have been around for 500 years with exactly that rate, and you would still have in a single year more people dying from a disease that was permitted by politicians and our medical health authorities to spread in this country. And yet all of the wrath, all of the protests, all of the ire and the anger last year continuing into this one is levied for something that kills literally a very small fraction of that number. Is that fair? Is that a good way for society to allocate its resources? Or is this misspent because it serves some of the population, because it riles people up, because it's politically polarizing, which means it gets attention and it makes the media money and it makes politicians money and it makes Black Lives Matter, the organization, money? Is this like the most efficient use of our social resources? Or is this a waste of time in the same year that homicides have gone up something like 20% to rates that we haven't seen in over 20 years? I'm done now.
I mean, look. COVID is bad, yes. And there are all sorts of problems in the world. There are wars, there's disease, there's famine. There's all sorts of problems in the world. That has nothing to do with cops killing 1,000 people a year and whether or not that's acceptable. I mean, for God's sake, if that was my kid, if that was my mom, if that was my aunt, if that was my grandparents, I would have dramatic issues with that. And so, the fact that COVID is bad is nothing to do with cops killing 1,000 people a year. I'm not even sure how the correlation is set. I don't even know how that becomes part of the conversation in regards to policing. I think the comparison is, what does policing look like across the globe? And is the 1,000 a year a dramatic departure from other countries and the way that they do their policing? And that answer is indubitably yes. I mean, for God's sake, I think we killed more people from the standpoint of cops in 24 days. I think this was back in 2015 than I think it was Britain did in 24 years or something like that. Like, the numbers are so out of whack.
But it also, and you can tie this into gun violence, or you could tie it into the simply higher rates of crime and the proliferation of gangs spurred by the drug war and long-term economic malaise in the States. There are other things that I could meaningfully bring into the conversation. And the reason that I brought up COVID and our wars is that they kill a lot of people. And we only have so much attention. And whatever attention we allocate to given issues, whatever attention the media makes money from allocating to given issues, and whatever people are fundraising on at any given point, matters. It takes away from things that you could spend on others. I'll put it like this. If we spent literally our entire show day in and day out covering this issue, it would not be doing our listeners justice. And it wouldn't be good for our minds, I'm sure, either. We focus on foreign policy. We focus on different domestic policies, et cetera. We try to bring it in together. And ideally, in terms of what the public is paying attention to, I feel like this has taken up so much attention and so much space, and it's polarized us so much more. The protests over this and the pushback. And I don't know what it's accomplished. And meanwhile, as we're going to be talking about later, the people who were fundraising on the protest last summer, BLM, we're going to get into it, but they're spending millions of dollars on homes. That's how they're allocating their attention, apparently.
I got to be honest. I don't understand your argument here, Shane. The cops murdered a child the other day. Cops killed a 20-something-year-old the other day. Cops kill 1,000 people a year. And the question that's presented to us is whether or not that is something that we're okay with as a society. The fact that COVID killed 500,000 is irrelevant to this, even though I get your point. I mean, you're trying to make the point of we have a very limited attention span. And from the standpoint of the number of people that are killed by cops versus other things, this seems to be a smaller number. But I guess my thing is that is irrelevant. And we're talking, that's like apples and gorillas in regards to what we're talking about. If you were part of the family members that died as a result of that, you would be dramatically bothered by that. And just from what you would consider to be the ridiculousness of it all, just from the standpoint of you would consider the injustice of it all, the injustice of it in and of itself is pressing and is overwhelming, especially to the people who this directly affects. I had a family member of mine, and he walks outside. The cop comes to the house. There are like 3 or 4 cops. The cops come to the house. They pull him outside. He comes outside. I think he has like a toothbrush or something. One cop fires, kills. The other cops didn't shoot because the other cops didn't see anything wrong or didn't see anything going on. But because he like flinched or something, that cop took his life. Like, that's horrendous. And that shouldn't, I mean, for God's sake, when I was in the hospital, I remember watching, this was in, I believe it was in Utah. It was a white child. I think he was like 13. He was having some kind of emotional issue. The cops come and murder that child. They shoot that child in front of the mom. The mom is losing it at that moment, saying, oh my God, I can't believe you just murdered my kid. Like, I guess my thing is this takes place all the time. I agree with you that there are all sorts of things, from the standpoint of wars and COVID, that eat up a lot of lives. But the injustice of this, Shane, is monstrous. It is monstrous. And the protests and everything else, those people don't want to be out there protesting. Nobody does. I hope you understand what I mean. Like, the injustice is something that we shouldn't ignore, and we shouldn't underestimate or undermine. I just don't think it's a good position to try to make it diminutive, the pain and anguish that individuals are feeling, what they consider to be injustice by what is supposed to be the arbiters on some level of justice. I just think it's problematic. I mean, do you see where I'm getting at on that? Like that undermining that is,
I think it's completely irrelevant. We need to go to a break. Well, okay, what are you talking about? It's offensive on some. Okay. So if anybody feels, if gun rights activists want to get out there because they very dearly believe that the government is about to take away their guns, and that if they do so, you're going to see a rampant increase in tyranny, the likes of which America, let alone the world, hasn't ever seen. If they feel that way, or if pro-life activists, anti-abortion activists, whatever you want to call them, anti-choice activists, I don't care, if they believe that it is absolutely dear to their hearts that, their child, if it were born to another mother or another father, could be killed by a hospital, by a doctor sitting in a hospital somewhere. If any issue that is near to somebody's hearts is suddenly immune from criticism because I'm about to offend the person who's doing it by pushing back on it, or comparing it to something else they could be doing with their time, then that has a chilling effect on all of civil society.
Wait, don't you believe that I'm telling you that you can't criticize it? I never said that.
No, you said that it's offensive. You said you closed by.
I said that it could be considered offensive. Yeah, if my kid had been killed by a cop,
do you consider it offensive? Do you consider it offensive? Or are you trying to speak on behalf of other people?
Look, I never said, and again, this is one of those things where it's a straw man. Again, I never said, just like I never said it was racist or never brought up the racist thing. I never said that people couldn't criticize it. I never said you couldn't criticize it. I said my issue with it has to be with that.
I didn't say you didn't.
I said that undermining it and creating it as if it's diminutive could be considered offensive, especially if you're one of the people that were killed or had family members that were killed by the cops. That's what I'm saying. If you're Tamir Rice's mom, and they hear an argument of like, yeah, man, you guys are putting too much energy and investing too much energy into pushing back on what you consider to be injustice. Yeah, I could see how somebody considered it offensive. That is separate and distinct, however, from whether or not you can criticize it. People can be offended by all sorts of things. Doesn't mean you can't criticize it. I guess I'm saying don't jump to the conclusion, or don't jump to this thing of saying I'm saying one thing when I'm not saying that. I'm making the point of saying some people would consider it that way if you are downplaying the significance and severity of cops killing people. I think that, I'm just saying, don't undermine that. Don't underestimate that. That's
here's the thing. We have a guest. We have a guest, and we need to go to a break. But do you actually think that I am underplaying that, or do you think that I'm bringing up other things that simultaneously happen? Okay, well, we can get into that. We're going to be coming back.
Yeah,
we're going to be coming back on this conversation.
I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. I don't want to, It just sounds like you're saying that other things that people can invest their time into, and this doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal for people to be out there protesting.
And I agree, but I didn't say that any less than 1,000 people died at the hands of police this year. I just said that other people have died from a lot more, and not nearly as much of our attention is being allocated to condemning the people who are responsible for those deaths. And it seems convenient to the status quo political system. Whether that's underplaying it or whether by leaving it out you're underplaying all those other causes of deaths, that remains to the listener to be determined. But we need to go into a break. We're going to be coming back.
People can listen to your statements and they can make their own assessment. So that's fair.
Of course, that's the nature of human beings in some level. We got to go into a break. We're going to be back with Ted Raul on the other side here, continuing the conversation about Derek Chauvin trial, police miscarriage of justice, and where this takes our society. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're talking the Chauvin trial and policing, as the jury is currently out deliberating on whether or how guilty Derek Chauvin is in the alleged killing of George Floyd last May. We're coming up on the 1-year bitter anniversary of Floyd's death, and police have mobilized Minnesota's government, I should say, has mobilized upwards of 125 National Guard troops to join Minneapolis's police force to suppress civil unrest that is expected outside of the courthouse in Minneapolis. They have barbed wire and police there pretty much on constant duty as the public awaits the verdict from the jury. To talk about the role policing plays in our society and the shift in public opinion over the last year. We are joined by Ted Raul. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist who you can follow on Twitter at TEDRALL. Ted Raul. Also check out his cartoons and articles at raul.com. Ted, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it on such short notice. How are you doing this morning?
I'm just fine. Spring allergies are killing me, but otherwise I'm okay. How are you?
I got that too. I started to get those yesterday, and at first, like you pretty much always do, I thought it was a cold or something, but it restricted itself to just the sinusy symptoms. Anyway, I'm sorry to hear that. I hope you feel better. But thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it. And so far, you sound good. Let's talk about Chauvin and policing. Jamarl, it might make sense to just get immediately back into the conversation that Jamarl and I were just getting into. But I want to bring you in for your take. I think you're going to be a little bit closer to his side than mine, but that's A-okay. I can take it. We're basically talking about whether or not whether there was an overreaction effectively to policing, or whether this focus is justified. Briefly, my case, as I'll state it, is 1,000 people get killed by police unjustly. Just use that as this sort of loose definition, unjustly every year. Police kill 1,000 unarmed people on an annual basis. Meanwhile, this year, 576,000 people have died from COVID, and the United States government routinely engages in unjust wars overseas, killing millions when it's in the true peaks of its violence. And it seems to me like there's not nearly as much ire and wrath placed on either the government's failed COVID response, although it's getting better recently, or on our unjust wars overseas. And that seems to have died down in favor of sort of quotidian, constant, cyclical political crises, whether it's police violence or whether it's abortion. It seems like I guess my point is, it seems like we're preoccupied with the polarizing domestic issues at home, including this one. And I would put this one in that category. And we're missing out on other ways in which the government really does serious harm. That's my take. Jamarl pushed back on me in different ways. What's yours, Ted?
Well, certainly media coverage and attention and politics are a zero-sum game, right? I mean, if you pay attention to one issue, by definition, that sucks air out of the room in terms of discussing another issue. And it's also true that anything that seems personal is going to take precedence in the minds of the public over anything that seems more abstract, right? So, a drone killing far away of people who are unknown to us, are not humanized. It's something that the American public's not going to care as much about as, say, domestic policing. But the thing is, there's a symbolic aspect to the beyond that goes beyond the number of deaths in the aggregate that also plays an important role in discussing these political issues, right? I mean, so for example, for me, there's I'm very deeply concerned about killings of innocent people overseas by American troops because these are the result, aside from the tragedies of the devs themselves, it's also the result of a conflict that should not have occurred in the first place, and is an act of imperialist aggression and is disgusting. I think the same thing is true, in terms of police shootings, are particularly disgusting because the people who are paid by taxpayers are being killed, murdered by the very same people whose salaries they're paying supposedly in order to keep them safe. And the hypocrisy and the gap between calling cops heroes, especially after we saw the years after 9/11, and the reality of the way that they police the streets is so disgusting that it's appalling. I think it's also more personal psychologically because regardless of the color of your skin, you're going to be afraid when you come into contact with the police if you're smart at all. So I am. I'm afraid of cops. Very afraid of them.
Ted,
So,
I do not want to be one-on-one with any cop. They have a screw loose. I don't want to deal with it. And you're right.
Yeah.
These are basically people who are supposed to be paid to protect and serve that are roaming around flagrantly abusing the rights of people. Meaning, take the murder off the table for the moment. The 1,000 killings, which is dramatically out of whack from the standpoint of the rest of the world. I mean, you might get into Yemen or somewhere like that, but from the standpoint of industrialized nations, this just doesn't happen. And then you add on just the abuses that take place throughout the course of a day. Like, it doesn't even have to go to the killing. You're talking about the abuse, the beating, the injury. You have situations where a cop beats somebody, the guy bleeds, and then the cop charges the guy for bleeding on him, talking about it's an assault. You get this kind of weird stuff, and then you get an impunity with the justice system that basically, for all intents and purposes, allows it. That's a massive, massive deal to have going on in your society. And that's, regardless of the other stuff that takes place that is bad. Nothing value is not absolute. Value, those things aren't necessarily cosmic. And you can have a society that says, yeah, this is unacceptable for us to be paying these people and for them to be behaving in this way. I mean, what are your thoughts, Ted? I mean, I get that there's COVID, but does 500,000 COVID deaths matter in any case or at all in regards to cops killing 1,000 people a year? I don't see how the two are related. It's like apples and gorillas. I mean, what are your thoughts? Or are they related in some way?
Well, Jamarl, I totally agree that, I'm glad you brought up the issue that it's beyond just the murders, right? Because the thing about violence is it's the threat of violence, the credible threat of violence that makes the police so terrifying. The odds of any one individual listening to us being killed by a cop is pretty low. But we all know that they can do it and get away with it. Therefore, it makes us terrified and compliant when they screw us over. I mean, and the thing is, for most people, interaction with the police is by far the most frequent interaction that we have as citizens with government officials or employees of the state. So therefore, it's a profound betrayal when a cop does something as idiotic or as cruel or as rapacious as writing you a ticket for an offense that you didn't commit. or for like in the case of Sandra Bland, aside from the fact that she died in custody, the fact that the cop zoomed up behind her to try to get her to change lanes without signaling, to fluster her, and then so that he could write her a ticket for not using her turn signal. I mean, even if that's all that had happened, if I were her, I would have spent the rest of my life thinking, the state is evil. It's not on my side. Why am I paying these people? I feel like I've broken trust with my government. And I think so it's really profound in that sense. It's not just the fact that 1,000 people die a year. It's the fact that, this is because 1,000 people die a year, they can do whatever the hell they want. Now, in terms of the COVID deaths, obviously that feels more like an act of God. Like, yes, the state should have more. They still could be doing more. They're not doing a good job. It goes to competence and incompetence, but it kind of feels like, well, who can stop a virus, right? Viruses just happen. And so even though that may or may not be true, I just think our brains process those two death counts very differently.
Ted,
we've got to close it out here.
Yeah, I want to thank you for joining us. I know this was short notice. So definitely, I appreciate you coming in. The voice that you guys were listening to is Ted Raul. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Raul and read his cartoons and articles at raul.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been following the events that have been taking place in Syria. We had the special fortune to have Alina Dunan to come on to the show. She was UN Special Rapporteur for unilateral sanctions, and she was able to give us a rundown in regards to the conditions currently on the ground in Syria as a result of not just the wars themselves, but also the sanctions that preceded and came after and during those wars. 500,000 people have died as a result of those wars. We dropped, at least by the New York Times estimate, over $1 billion to knock over the government of Syria, while using the pretext of terrorism, despite the fact that we were using those terrorists as a battering ram to knock down the Assad government. Currently, Syria is in severe crisis. There's food shortages, there's fuel shortages, and a lot of that has to do with the area in the region to which the United States is basically taken. And that region, heavy in oil, heavy in crops. And we've thrust that country into famine and into an energy crisis. To have a conversation about what is taking place on the ground in Syria, we're joined by Hadi Nasrallah. He's a journalist, commentator, and researcher on the ground in Syria, focused on politics, international relations, and diplomacy in Syria, Lebanon, and the global jihadist terrorism. Hadi, welcome to the show. And am I pronouncing your name right? Hadi Nasrallah.
Hello, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's correct.
Absolutely. So let's just start at the beginning. What is currently taking place in Syria? And did I explain it correctly? Is there anything that you want to augment that I said just as a basis of explanation? And
yeah.
And then second point, what has been the effect of those sanctions? Meaning, aside from the war itself, which in and of itself was disastrous in regards to the number of people that were killed and so forth, what has been the effect of the sanctions, and what has been the effect of the U.S. military being in the northern region of Syria that is basically taking crops and oil?
All right, I'm going to start with Syria when it comes to the situation of the sanctions, and I can assure you that the sanctions are hurting people much, much more than the war itself. And during my last visits in Syria, and the comparison between now and before, even during the Battle of Ghouta or the Battle of Aleppo, when I used to go to Aleppo during the battle, people were not suffering as much as they are suffering right now after the Caesar Act was implemented against the Syrian people, because the economic situation is getting much worse every single day. People are finding it hard to find fuel, finding it hard to find bread, anything that's basically necessary for your daily life, right? So throughout the years, after the liberation of many areas, where Syrians starting to feel relief because now there's no more mortars falling on them, no more car bombs, no more suicide bombings, no more attacks. Syrians were starting to feel relief until the Caesar Act was implemented. Even then, the Syrians thought, okay, we have our own oil factories, we have our own wheat production, we have our own. Basically, they were self-sufficient before the war, so they thought they can do that again. Up until, again, the U.S. regime occupied the regions where Syria count on for extracting oil, or the regions where they have their wheat. The wheat was burned with the help of Turkey, of course, and NATO, and in Idlib as well, and North Aleppo, not just northern Syria, the area where the Kurdish militia occupy it. And the oil, of course, is being stolen. First, it was stolen by ISIS, and then it was stolen by Turkey, and now it is being stolen by the U.S. regime. And every time the Syrian army tries to advance against ISIS in areas like Deir ez-Zor to recontrol some of the oil fields, out of nowhere, the U.S.-led international coalition just comes in and attacks the Syrian forces. They don't attack ISIS, they attack the Syrian forces, and hundreds of soldiers die in one attack. That happened twice in 2016 under Obama. So now Syrians are looking at the situation as if, okay, what are we going to do now? It's becoming difficult for them. The lines, just to fill your, and there's a limit. So you usually you can get cheap oil. You can fill your car with it. Now you can't get more than, I'm gonna say, like, I don't know, $4, and you stand in line for 3 hours just to get some oil that I don't think that can last you for 2 days. So that's the situation in Syria right now, and it's becoming much more difficult. And the Caesar Act is making it worse for Syria to reconstruct its country after this devastating war, which we thought was going to start basically 2 years ago, but now everything is bad for the country.
It keeps getting extended. And just one quick point on the Caesar Act. The name of the act is literally the Syria Civilian Protection Act of 2019. So the name, and this is characteristic of a lot of the different types of humanitarian, quote unquote, humanitarian interventions that the United States chooses to engage in. We say that we're doing it for humanitarian reasons. We do it. And inevitably, what gets hurt the most is humanity, the exact humans that we're ostensibly trying to protect with what we're doing here. Now, fighting is ongoing, but it seems to have slowed down significantly. It doesn't seem and here's what I mean. It doesn't seem like the battle lines have been redrawn, even though airstrikes continue, even though just the other day, I believe it was Russia that killed 200 Islamist militants in a single set of airstrikes. The battle is continuing and people continue to die, but the lines have mostly been largely static for, as far as I can tell, years now. 2 points. One, if I'm wrong there, please correct me. And number two, within the last couple of weeks, Germany has yet again decided to give almost $2 billion in aid, a little bit more than they had been doing in the years prior, to refugees from Syria, but also to people in Syria specifically. How has that aid worked? Has that worked? Where is it going? And where, since they're under sanctions, since they don't have access to the crops grown in their own country, how are people living under the Syrian government? How are these civilians? What food do they have access to? Where is aid coming from at this point? Adi.
All right, I'm going to talk about my experience when it comes to the donations, international donations, or I don't know, like organizations and stuff, which I've been following from the UK to Syria, and I've been actually blocked by a lot of organizations because I found out that their money is going to jihadist groups in Syria. But the thing is, when it comes to countries like Germany, and they say they want to support the Syrian people, I just want to know exactly what Syrian people are they talking about. In government-held regions, there are more than 90 million Syrians living there under Western sanctions, and they're being attacked by Western-backed jihadists every single day. That's one. Whilst the areas controlled by the jihadists or so-called moderate rebels, which I can't seem to find any of them, there are around, let's say in Idlib, for example, there are around 3 million people, maybe less, and many of them are not even, a lot of them are not even Syrian, they're foreign jihadists. So you say you want to help the Syrian people, and yet your money is going to 3 million people under terrorist control. So you're giving the money to the people in control there. So you're giving the money to terrorism, who are basically holding 3 million people as hostages, but you're refusing to help 90 million Syrians because you hate their government, and you're sanctioning them. You're harming them. You're not harming the government at all with your sanctions. So this is when it comes to when some countries offer their help and their aid is not going to help the Syrian people. If you want to help the Syrian people, just lift the sanctions. Just like you said in the beginning, it's called the Caesar Act civilian protection. It's always about civilian protection until it's too late, and then they come. Just like when I shared the foreign policy headlines, before the Caesar Act, they said it's an overdue effort to starve the Assad regime of the sources that fuel its atrocities. And then after the Caesar sanction, the same foreign policy, they said, the Caesar Act isn't hurting Assad, it's harming civilians. So the same thing happened in Iraq when they told us they're helping the civilians, and then 500,000 child died.
Yeah.
And Madeleine Albright, she said it's worth it.
It's worth that. Think about that. I'm glad you brought that up, because sanctions are an act of war. And I have made that point more than one occasion that Madeleine Albright, just before the Iraq war, they put on sanctions that killed 500,000 kids. And we're not even talking about the adults, just 500,000 children. And in that interview, yeah, you're right, Madeleine Albright was asked, hey, there are a lot of kids that died as a result of these sanctions. I mean, do you think that was worth it? She says, yeah, I think it's worth it. 500,000 kids died. And then you have a war that started in the very next administration, meaning if it was worth it, and you got what you wanted, why did you have a war afterwards that ended up killing 1 million people on top of the 500,000 kids that died? Al Blinken, I want you to respond to something Al Blinken said. Al Blinken made a point of saying, I care about my children, and we should care about the kids in Syria. Now, I made the point that this is disgusting, offensive even, on so many levels, for Blinken to be putting through policy and actions that are killing children while simultaneously saying we should care about those kids. What do you have as a response to some Americans that have this idea that we are doing God's work in the other countries around the world? We're doing God's work in Syria. What is your response to those people? And for that matter, to government officials that are arguing that we are for the best in Syria, that Idlib is a great thing. PBS, by the way, interviewed one of the warlords that are in Idlib. Now, keep in mind, Idlib, based on UN own appraisal, I think there was like 30,000 terrorists that are based in Idlib. And PBS is talking to this guy, and the guy's like, we could be a good partner with the United States and all of this other stuff. It's deplorable. What is your response to the people like Blinken, to the people like Psaki, to the people like the Biden administration, and to those Americans that honestly believe that we are doing God's work in Syria and that the problem in Syria is Assad? What are your thoughts? What's your perspective?
Well, basically, when I hear people like that talking that they care about children, I'm speechless when I hear stuff like that, especially from people who work in the U.S. regime, who is currently, I don't know, the things I saw in Syria have been happening in the past years, and the Western media is not talking about it. So when we talk about children, or we talk about this Julani, who was interviewed by a Western journalist, I just invite people to just one massacre. I want them to read about one massacre, which is Rashidin Aleppo massacre. All right? If they care about children, yet Al-Julani, who was backed by the West, gathered children, his militants, they gathered children, starved children, just because they come from a different religion. They gathered them with potato crisps. They wanted to lure them in. Once they all came, a suicide bomber attacked them. More than 100 child was butchered in one attack. And then CNN went on the news and they said, "Oh, this is a hiccup." And they called the children Assad supporters. They said Assad supporters were
less than one.
They were children. Every single one of them is under 12 or under 15. So this is
astonishing.
The people who say they care about our children. So such massacres they don't talk about. But when there's, for example, this child, when the
Heidi, we do have to stop it. But I'm glad you mentioned that. And this happened. This was a few days ago, several years ago, right? Like this was the anniversary of this was only a few days ago. Okay, let's do this. Let Hadi Nasrallah, he's a journalist, commentator, and researcher on the ground in Syria, focused on politics, international relations, and diplomacy. His focus is on Syria, Lebanon, and global jihadist terrorism. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning, at least, of the most disruptive show in these divided states, covering news, events, politics, and more from across the disunited states of America and from across the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. I want to give folks a quick rundown of today's show before I get into the headlines. At 7:30 a.m. Eastern this morning, we spoke with Yusuf Aram on Turkish foreign policy and domestic economic policy. We were talking Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, and how Turkey sees itself in NATO as NATO's largest military member on that side of the Atlantic, effectively, one of the larger of the members of NATO. And yet, as Turkey is simultaneously striving for independent foreign policy, which was the phrase that Yusuf said characterized sort of Turkey's internal perspective on how things are changing and where it sees itself going. And as, of course, other countries also start to pursue more independent foreign policy, too, that is free from, the overbearing influence, or at least trying to get free from the overbearing influence of the United States. At 8:30, we had a brief conversation with Ted Raul on the Derek Chauvin trial and the state and importance of policing and police killings in America today. At 8:45, we just finished up a conversation with Hadi Nasrallah, journalist, commentator, and researcher on the ground in Syria. We were talking about the state of the Syrian civil war, the effects of sanctions in the country, the state of the war in the country, and hypocrisy, specifically from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, but generally from the American political and military class, talking about how we want to defend children by killing children, talking about how we want to advance humanitarian rights by eroding them with our sanctions and our wars. And later this hour, we are planning on speaking with Camila Escalante about the turnover of power in Cuba as Raul Castro is handing over the reins to his successor. Without further ado, though, let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, at least 483 new coronavirus deaths and 70,355 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 67,175 cases per day. That's an increase of 4% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Monday evening, last night, more than 31,761,200 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 567,200 have died from it. In all of the United States, and that includes Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, vaccines are now available to all adults. This comes as upwards of half of the American public has received at least one vaccine shot. It also comes after President Biden set a goal of administering 200 million doses by his 100th day in office, which the nation seems set to meet at this point. The CDC is convening this Friday to evaluate adverse effects from the J&J shot, with one spokesperson saying that, quote, it quote, hasn't been an overwhelming number of cases, but what we're looking and seeing, what's coming in. end quote. Fauci has said that he expects that a warning will be added to the shot, but that it will still be available for use. And again, we're speaking of the Johnson & Johnson shot, which appears to cause, in extremely rare cases, an obscure blood clotting condition called cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, CVST, which when we were speaking with Dr. Mikhail Kogan about this last week, he said that he had to pull out his medical school textbooks in order to sort of, refresh himself on what we were even talking about here. That's how obscure it is. It's not something that he was familiar with off the top of his head. But of course, the concern that he expressed is that as more variants pop up and as we sort of develop the vaccines and modify them to match those variants, you could see something that's causing a relatively small issue now, causing larger issues later, and they're trying to get to the bottom of it before we reach that point. In India, the country of India, yesterday, they registered 273,810 new infections and 1,619 new deaths, with the state government announcing yesterday that vaccines would be available to all adults from the start of this next month. In national political news back here in the United States, yesterday the prosecution and the defense gave their closing arguments in the trial of Derek Chauvin over the killing of George Floyd. And now the jury has gone into deliberations. That's a process that could take just a few days or could take longer. The defense asked Judge Peter Cahill to rule a mistrial following words from California Congresswoman Maxine Waters. The judge denied that request, although he cautioned that Maxine Waters' comments could give the defense room to appeal the verdict of the trial. Waters had previously called on protesters to become more confrontational, quote unquote. This is just nights after dozens were arrested by Brooklyn Center police following the shooting of Daunte Wright. Barbed wire and armed soldiers are currently set up around the Minneapolis courtroom, and Minnesota's governor has activated 125 National Guardsmen to support Minnesota police in preparation for the delivery of the verdict. Former Vice President Walter Mondale has passed away. So he served from 77 to 81 under President Jimmy Carter. He was 93 at the time of his passing. The chief medical examiner of Washington has found that Officer Brian Sicknick's death was natural and not caused by a breach of the Capitol. Sicknick reportedly died from strokes. This comes after a wave of allegations from the media. First, that Sicknick had died from blunt trauma to the head after protesters struck him with a fire extinguisher, and then that he died after being attacked with bear spray, which I remember us trying to figure out at the time. It seemed confusing, and it still does, and it makes more sense that that was not the cause of his death. Again, unless he was like allergic to it, bear spray is not the kind of thing that kills people. A fire extinguisher does, but a couple things that came out. For one thing, his family said that he called them that night and said that he was fine, and I'm sure he wouldn't be saying that if he died from blunt trauma to the head. And for another, that just seems like an incredibly easy cause of death to rule out. So why did that rumor, why did the media sustain that rumor for so long? And why was it, as Glenn Greenwald said in his article on this yesterday, why was it that people who were saying, no, that's not the cause of death, why were they labeled Sicknick truthers and castigated as if they were members of a white nationalist movement, as if they were conspiracy theorists on the level of QAnon? I guess maybe there's some continuum, but I don't know, between the people who are making those claims and other more fringe elements. But can't you just use that metastacism to justify shutting down pretty much any other element of free speech if one person makes an argument and the other person makes another argument, and it seems somehow tangentially related? You can make it tangentially related. Then does that mean that the person A, all of the qualities apply to person B? Maybe I'm getting too weeds into the logic of it here, but no, of course it doesn't. But that's what people do, and that's what they did. And the media, again, like they did with the Russian bounty stories, like they did with Russiagate, like they do with so many things, they lied endlessly and increasingly, apparently, over the course of American history. And they focused in on it. And why did they do that? Well, because they needed to make Sicknick's death something that the Capitol breach protesters were responsible for. Because after all, the 4 people that died that day, everybody who died, as far as we can tell, that died that day, died on the pro-Trump side, on the protester side. In other words, what you're missing here, okay, you have the crime, but what you need is a victim. If you want to embolden the case that the people who are responsible for this breach are just guilty, sinful, terrible human beings, what you need is to show that they actually hurt somebody. And I don't like what they did. I think it was terrible for American democracy that they raided the Capitol, but it's apparently, less vibrant for the media. It's less lurid if they can't give you an example of somebody that actually got killed. And so they used Sicknick. They lied about how he died. They made his family's life a lot worse, and they eroded his legacy by lying about him. Jamarl, we've talked about this before, but any quick comment here?
Not in particular. Say the last thing that you said, though, just so I'm making sure we're on the same page.
Basically, they lied about Sicknick. They lied about him endlessly because they needed to keep their narrative going.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I don't understand how they got that so monstrously wrong. Like, because if you think about it, it initially was he was beaten to death with a fire extinguisher. Okay, that's very specific. That's uber specific. Who had the fire extinguisher? Who was holding the fire extinguisher? Do you have images of him being beaten to death by a fire extinguisher? Why do you believe it was a fire extinguisher? Like, those start to come into play first, right? And then it becomes, okay, well, it's not a fire extinguisher, it's bear spray. All right. The fire extinguisher is uber specific, but if we're taking that out and we're going to the bear spray, and now you're telling me it's natural causes. How long has this been? How many months? 5 months? 3, 4 months? And you're just now getting around to saying, okay, natural causes. But that means that for the last 4 months, they got it wrong. The perpetual narrative that they kept was wrong. And
yeah, look, three and a half months now.
Yeah, 3.5 months. I mean, but this is whether we're talking about the Russian bounty, whether we're talking about the OPCW report that they don't want to acknowledge, whether we're talking about, the Iraq war, whether we're talking about the Syria chemical weapons. All of these things bespeak of a media that can't deal with when they get stuff wrong, that doesn't account for when they get stuff wrong, and they just move on as if nothing happened. People make mistakes, fair enough, but this goes beyond just a mistake.
Yeah, I was going to put it like this. Mockingbird, the CIA program to influence the media, was bad enough. Where, you have the CIA with agents inserted into and with influence over the editorial decisions of various branches of the news media in the United States, trying to exert control over what they covered in order to, in some cases, cover up the CIA's own tracks, to sort of use propaganda, to use the media as a blunt cudgel to shape the perspectives of the electorate in America. That was bad enough. But what we see here is a sort of boundaryless continuum, a complete hand-in-glove situation where what's in the best interests of certain elements of the American state, of the American intelligence agencies, of certain memberships, certain portions of the political parties, there's just no line between the two anymore. And it is both direct interference in what the media chooses to cover by leak after leak after leak, not from whistleblowers, but simply from disgruntled or whatever intel employees. That's been happening for years now. It was normalized under Trump. This accepting of rumors from the very people who would most benefit from lying to you, accepting their rumors as if they were sacred truth. It's both that and this culture, this pervasive culture that few seem ready to defy. And then when people do define them, coming back to Glenn Greenwald, the way they do that is not through those news publications. They go off on their own. They start up their own blogs. They start up their own subscription services. A lot of this conversation has happened on Substack, around the publishing platform Substack recently, where people are bringing in a decent amount of money. Independent journalists are bringing in a decent amount of money. That's where they feel safe doing it. They had to exit the system effectively because the system is so goddamn corrupt, inward looking and inward referencing, like a slow motion train wreck for information. Anyway, we've got more headlines, but it's a terrible state of affairs. Vice President Harris has said her role in responding to the migrant crisis is, quote, a diplomatic focus on the Northern Triangle. It is about bringing together, as I did now, I think a couple of weeks ago, the members of the cabinet, end quote, specifically from the Departments of Commerce and Agriculture, also saying that she has asked Japan's Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga if he could help in the region. In other words, the migrant crisis on our southern border is no longer a crisis, and it no longer has to do with our southern border. Instead, it is a diplomatic crisis and a political and economic one in the nations to our south. That's how they're pivoting on this. Comes as White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki walked back a claim of President Biden's on Saturday when he said that, quote, the problem was that the refugee part was working on the crisis that ended up on the border with young people, end quote. Psaki said that Biden actually believes there is a crisis in Central America. And she said this. Andre, let's play this clip.
The president does not feel that children coming to our border seeking refuge from violence, economic hardships, and other dire circumstances is a crisis. He does feel that the crisis in Central America, the dire circumstances that many are fleeing from, that is a situation we need to spend our time, our effort on, and we need to address it if we're going to prevent more of an influx of migrants from coming in years to come.
Andre, I'm going to ask you, can you please line that clip up? Because I just want to play the first couple of seconds again of that. I know we're close to the end of headlines here, but I want to hit this again. It is significant. Let's play that one more time, please, Andre.
The president does not feel that children coming to our border seeking refuge from violence, economic hardships, and other dire circumstances is a crisis. He does.
Let's end it right there. That's what I want to focus on. He does not feel that this situation is a crisis. Jamarl, I want to turn to you. Is the migrant crisis, I'm falling into it, is the situation at our southern border where thousands of kids and other people of different ages are being held in overcrowded facilities, sometimes over 10 times the rate at which they should be, susceptible to the spread of COVID and just generally in a pretty crappy situation. Is that a crisis or isn't it? What say you, President Jamarl Thomas?
He says it's not, Shane. He says his feeling about it is that's not a crisis. That's not a crisis. That's a cause of concern. That's what it is, Shane. It's a cause of concern. And then I love the way that the media just says, okay. Okay. It's like, you don't believe that all of those kids at the border filling up, meaning the images that people saw, the video that people saw, with those kids lying on the ground, cheek to cheek, in these facilities that you didn't even want to show the American public because of how bad it was. We don't feel that that's a crisis. Get out of here. It is a crisis. It is a crisis.
Yeah, people lying in Mylar body bags or whatever that is to stay warm as they're crowded, as they're packed in there cheek to jowl, just lining the room. It looks like a morgue. It looks like an overcrowded morgue filled with dead COVID victims or something like that. If you released those earlier on in the year, you could very well see that with the caption, these are the results in New York City or something like that. It looks horrible. And it's not just the optics, it's what people are actually living through down there. But what they're doing right now very clearly is trying to pivot it, making it not our responsibility, but the problem of these other countries to our south that we are trying to help. Never mind the fact that Biden, in my opinion, tacitly encouraged folks to come up here. Never mind the fact that this has been an ongoing problem for years. You just focus for a second on the idea that we overthrew and destabilized economically a lot of these countries with our drug war and with literal overthrows of some of their governments,
even recently,
like Honduras specifically back in 2008. Recently. That's not that long ago.
Honduras wasn't that long ago. Bolivia wasn't that long ago. Brazil wasn't that long ago. And I know Brazil is a soft coup, so fair enough. But we were still giving them data and information that they could use in Operation Car Wash to go against Lula. I mean, we even bragged that we had something to do with getting rid of a president, whether that was Rousseff or Lula. Like, those things matter. Like, if you overthrow Honduras, and then you have a situation where a few years later, 80% of the cocaine that's coming into the country is coming through Honduras, then how is the president of the country a partner? Like, how is the new guy that you got in, that you approve of, as opposed to the guy that you didn't approve of, Zelias? You got rid of him, fair enough. But this new guy is assisting in the cocaine production being brought into the U.S. So, no, he's not a flaming lefty. By the same token, is he a partner? And you have to reconcile that. Yeah, Shane, you're right to put this up. I mean, you can't look at this and say it's everybody else's fault. And then nobody brings up, well, wait a minute, Jen, is it possible that our foreign policy in the South, knocking over the various governments that we don't particularly like, had something to do, that it was directly related to the number of people that show up at our border because of the chaos that's caused in those countries? Why don't anybody ask her that?
And here's the thing. This is one part of this that I sort of skipped over in the headline there that I want to focus. We're going over time, so I really got to close this. But Yoshihide Suga, on Saturday, he and Biden jointly addressed from the Rose Garden the press, did a joint news conference, mostly talking about China. Kamala Harris said that in a private meeting with him, she had asked Suga if he could help. He is the Japanese prime minister. He is on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. I'm sure he has his own problems. Japan's economy, there are lots of problems, long-term deflation. There are things they need to deal with. Why the hell are we going to them for help? Why are we asking Yoshihide Suga if he can help Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras and chief and foremost the United States with the migrant crisis and this whole what the hell? Why are we turning to him? What is the explanation for that? I'm sure she just wanted to say, well, we're working with our allies and, in other countries to try to, but God, it doesn't make any goddamn sense. We need to go into a break. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're coming back talking about Patrisse Cullors' BLM using millions of dollars in real estate purchases, while the mother of Breonna Taylor calls the Louisville BLM chapter fraudulent, as she hasn't received help. Anyway, we're coming back on this in a dedicated segment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. Couldn't get it out. My co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you guys want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So news was made April 17th when Breonna Taylor's mom comes out and basically slams Black Lives Matter Louisville as a fraud. Now, if you remember, Breonna Taylor was the woman that was laying in her bed, basically black while sleeping, and shot as a result when cops, pushing through a no-knock warrant, burst down the door and opened fire when her boyfriend basically tried to respond. They end up at the wrong house. She ends up dead, and the person who basically misses gets prosecuted. The other officers, clean murder. Now, Breonna Taylor's mom, you can imagine if it was your mom, or you can entirely imagine somebody's daughter being killed with such gravity of injustice associated with it, the level of distraught that she has to be experiencing this moment. Well, if you see organizations that are explicitly there, like Black Lives Matter, part of a movement, but also this idea, or at the very least this belief, that this group is working in the best effort or in efforts and pursuits associated with African Americans, well, Breonna Taylor, mom, would clearly fit into that. Well, Breonna Taylor's mom comes out and says, quote, this was on a post, but this post was eventually removed. She says, I have never personally dealt with Black Lives Matter Louisville and personally have found them to be a fraud. State Representative Attica Scott, another fraud, Tamika Parler wrote on Facebook. Now, she continues making the point of saying, right here, this is New York Post. Scott singled out, and the Post has been one of the leading proponents for a ban for no-knock warrants. Taylor was killed during a no-knock raid on her apartment. The city of Louisville paid Taylor's family $12 million in September. Right here, I've watched y'all raise money on behalf of Breonna's family, who has never done a damn thing for us. Talk about fraud, Palmer wrote. I could walk into a room full of people who claim to be here for Breonna's family, who don't even know who I am. I'm so sick of some of y'all. I'm done with this blank. Enough is enough. She has some feelings about it. She has some severe feelings about it. And you can understand why. What's interesting has to do with inside Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors. Now, frame the issue that Breonna Taylor's mom is having in the context of one of the founders purchasing 4 homes, equating up to millions of dollars. Now, what I didn't realize until reading this article was that Black Lives Matter pulled in millions, nearly hundreds of millions of dollars. I think it was like $90 million. And you could think to yourself, where's that money going? Now, she's an avowed Marxist, and we may have an issue. I don't think the Marxism stuff has a huge amount to do with it, even though I can understand where people are coming from the criticism of this. But if you...
I do.
Right. Shane is going to have more issues with this than I am, even though we're going to talk about it. But basically, she's buying up all of this real estate. She's purchasing all of this property. And the question becomes, well, wait a minute. Where are you getting money to purchase that property? And are you getting money from the Black Lives Matter initiative in and of itself in order to use for those purchases? Now, she says no. And in fact, in this kind of tearful rebuke, she makes the point and says none of the money that she got from Black Lives Matter was used for this. But there were also ventures for BLM that weren't entirely private, meaning there were for-profit ventures, and it is unclear how much she got from that. It is unclear how much she got from other things associated with the Black Lives Matter organization. Now, Hank Newsom has been calling for independent investigation. He's head of the Black Lives Matter Greater New York, which is affiliated with Con Cooler's Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. And he says there needs to be an independent investigation. And he makes the point right here that it's unfortunate that this is basically taking place because it casts, sends a dark glance on the entirety of the organization. Now, Shane, you take more issue with the Marxist thing. I think, a little bit more issue. Okay, I'm going to agree with you with the Marxist thing, but I'm going to agree with you not for the label, but for the real bare bones reality of it. Black Lives Matter is supposed to be an organization that is putting for the betterment of African Americans, especially from this thing of killing cops and everything else. This seems to be a breach of that. What are your thoughts?
Actually, yeah. Meanwhile, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter is spending millions of dollars on multiple real estate properties with, I think it's up, what does it count? 3 homes in LA right now. Now, Los Angeles, traffic is bad, but never at any point have I been like, well, it'd be really useful to have 2 or 3 properties spread out across the city, just so, if traffic is bad, I can hang out wherever I'm stuck and take a day or two there. It's ridiculous. I'm fixating on that just because it seems obscene to me. And I don't care on if this is an anonymous individual, if this is somebody who made a bunch of money and they're trying to use it and live a good life, whatever, do that. But if you pair that with the idea that the very people that some organization in the BLM Network Foundation should be helping, Breonna Taylor's mother in this case, the families of one of the most prominent victims of police violence last year, if you pair that with that, meanwhile, however she got this money, she's denying that she received that directly from the BLM network, but it is a foundation with a lot of different offshoots, which, as Jamarl pointed out, some of those are for profit. And it's hard to tell how that money is allocated. The foundation gives money to these other organizations. You don't know exactly how much it's giving to which ones. And you don't know how much money is being spent on what by those other organizations, because it's a network. And a lot of this stuff isn't available to public records. And this comes as, meanwhile, how much money did they make in 2020 last year off of the killings of Black people across the United States? $90 million, upwards of $90 million, nearly $100 million in that year alone. Now, what are they spending that money on? We were having a conversation yesterday, I believe it was, with Garland Nixon and betwixt ourselves about whether or not BLM was a success, whether or not it had managed to accomplish legislatively on different agendas what it should have accomplished given its size, its force, its cultural weight, all that stuff. I think we both came back in our different ways with the answer no. And if this is how they're spending their money, not actually helping the victims, not passing vital legislation, not doing nearly as much as they could be, I'm assuming, with a lot of money, then there's one explanation for it. And here's another thing. I'll pass it back to you, but one more thing. Apparently, Facebook. This story first came out early last week. Apparently, Facebook blocked the ability of users to share the report. They were saying that this was because it had to do with her personal information. They referenced privacy and personal information policy. I don't know about that. That just seems like a convenient excuse to shut down a story that they culturally don't want shared. Maybe, there's some backing on the back end that doesn't want to delegitimize BLM by seeing this shared. This is another example. This is coming from the New York Post of Facebook blocking a New York Post story, apparently because it's politically inexpedient for them for that story to be shared. Jamarl, any comments on that before we close?
Yeah, that's horrendous. I mean, this is, once again, what social media seems to be taking a dog in a hunt. Is it a platform or is it a publisher? You're acting like a publisher if you're making these type of determinations. I mean, there's nothing that should have stopped that story from coming out. Even if you didn't like the story, there is nothing stopping it. And just so we can give her a fair shake, Kohlers, she makes the point, she said, the movement began as and will remain a love letter to Black people. 3 words, Black Lives Matter. So as a reminder, Black people, that we are human and deserve to live vibrant and full lives. She wrote on Instagram, I've worked multiple jobs across multiple organizations in my entire life. I'm a published author, writer, producer, professor, public speaker, and performance artist. I love my work in all of these areas, and I provide for my family. Now, if she was able to get these homes as a result of these other pursuits, would that be fair game? Look, personally, I do think that if you're head of a movement, that's not the same thing as being head of a company. The impression is different. And when people were giving all of that money, they were giving that money with the thought that I personally can't expend my time to help with the propagation of Black folks in that issue. However, I will put my money into what I think will do that in my stead. Well, if it's not doing that, I mean, if it's not going to those causes, if it's not trying to tangibly and competently change our world order in the way that the world order is, but instead, in some way, going to her homes, that is dramatically problematic. And I could totally I could totally see how people have issue with that, especially since it's a black box. There doesn't seem to be any transparency in how the money is allocated, what the money is going to, etc. And if it was, maybe this would be less of a story. But
instead, she's focusing on whether she wants the Venetian blinds or the Greek columns, or whether she wants the redwood trees outside or the palm trees. She's spending how many millions of dollars she can afford, how many hundreds of acres in Albany, New York she can dole out. That's where her mind's at, apparently. It's not the benefit of the people who her organization is raising funds for. It's disgusting. I don't know how else to say it. And the Democrats, the left, and not even the Democrats, the progressive left specifically, the woke left, whatever, you should be pushing back hard on this, because this should not be the leadership for the movement. Whether as somebody who's an independent, maybe this isn't my thing to push or whatever, but it just seems like there's some cleaning of house that's in order here. We got to close this out. We're going to be coming back with Camila Escalante talking Cuba and more. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones, with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. One of the last communist governments in the world is at a crossroads, as Raul Castro has said he's stepping down. Let's play the clip.
Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel has been elected as first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba's Central Committee at the party's 8th Congress in Havana. The announcement that he was elected by delegates of the party Congress came from Army General Raul Castro, who presented the central report on the first day of the Congress and announced his decision to pass on the responsibility he had held as first secretary to the next generation.
I will continue on as a militant, as one more revolutionary fighter, ready to make my modest contribution until the end of my life. And let no one doubt it, that as long as I live, I will be ready, with my foot in the stirrup, to defend the homeland, the revolution, and socialism.
¡Viva Fidel! ¡Patria o muerte!
While that news made headlines, the revolutionary leader's historic intervention to the Congress elaborated on Cuba's socialist economic model. It addressed the critics of a one-party system and touched on the rights of social groups. On foreign matters, the former president addressed the strengthening of key international relations and the ongoing imperialist assault on the region. The intensified genocidal U.S. blockade on Cuba and its effects were also addressed at length. Raul also emphasized the redoubling of subversion, ideological and cultural influence, particularly online.
The program of subversion and ideological and cultural influence has been redoubled, aimed at discrediting the socialist model of development and presenting capitalist restoration as the only alternative. The subversive component of U.S. policy toward Cuba is focused on undermining national unity.
The four-day Congress began on the 60th anniversary of Commander Fidel Castro's proclamation of the socialist character of a Cuban revolution. After 3 days of debate leading to the adoption of agreements during the body's first plenary session and the election of 14 members of the Central Committee, the Congress came to a close on the 19th, a date which marks the 60th anniversary of the historic defeat of the U.S. invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Miguel Díaz-Canel, the new leader of the Communist Party, had this to say.
The Communist Party of Cuba will continue in the recognition and defense of our essences: independence, sovereignty, socialist democracy, peace, economic efficiency, security and the conquest of social justice, socialism. Comrade General of the Army, Minister, or simply Raul, on behalf of our comrades and of the Cuban people, thank you for your example, your drive.
He concludes his duty having contributed to the formation and preparation of a new generation of leaders and combatants of the revolution.
The voice that you guys were listening to is Camila Escalante, TV producer and presenter at Telesur English, who works for Kashwan News. Camila, thank you for joining us. That is a phenomenal intro. It seems that there's a changing of the guard. So what's going to remain the same and what's going to change in the context of this Castro stepping down? I mean, this is a change of an era almost.
It is, though obviously the new first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party is now Miguel Díaz-Canel, and he's been around for a very long time now. He's obviously of a different generation, but he has also been president for 3 years, and so we have already kind of seen his track record. And in Raul's speech, he said that Miguel Díaz-Canel is someone who, from a very young age, was raised among the ranks of the Communist Party with the ideals of Fidel and all the great leaders of the revolution, and that he's prepared to continue on, to continue on the development of the socialist economic model, but also, adding in some new elements. But during those 3 days of debate, they also elected the other 13 members of that Central Committee, and the majority of those people are individuals who were already in the committee. So it's not, I guess it's not as big of a change as maybe some of the news headlines, particularly in the West, made it out to be.
So it seems like this was the person who had been chosen. Is this a pick that you think that Fidel Castro would have approved of? Is this, in other words, this is, like Jamarl said, this is a significant change, and this isn't the end of an era, because as far as I know, under modern Cuba, it has, to this point, been completely run by the Castro family. And now there's a transfer of power to somebody outside of that family. Is that going to be from what I've just said, I'm guessing there's going to be a relatively seamless transition. But in other words, are there not internal party politics on the back end that would make this a contentious decision for the people who think that the Castro family should be in charge? Or is this going to be contentious? Is this going to be at all conflict inducing, or is this going to be seamless from your perspective? Camilla?
Virtually seamless and highly approved. The vote was something like 99%, and it's delegates from the entire party throughout the entire country. And he said that this is a transition that began about 10 years ago. They began planning from the perspective of the party to bring in a new generation, promote young people to leading positions. And they said in Raul's on the opening day during his central report, he said that that selections of people being promoted in the party have not always been the most successful. They've always tried to the extent possible to bring in women and, of course, Afro-Cubans, and to have more diversity within the leadership ranks. But they said that this is something that they've been trying to solve without haste and without improvisation. And they said that, he said before he announced that he would be stepping down, he said that he began to see a series of qualities in Miguel Diaz-Canel from a very young age, and all the positions he's been in, and that this was a result of thoughtful selection, he said, of a young revolutionary with the conditions. He always had the conditions to be promoted to higher positions. So he's someone who they see as very trustworthy, proven, and, just a lifelong of service to the revolution at his age.
Well, that's a good question. What does modern day communism look like? Like, what are the qualities that he's expecting in Miguel going forward? Because I would imagine that this choice, the thought is, what is going to be, what is Cuba going to look like in the future? What are we trying to move towards? What are the changes that we're trying to enact? And those changes within the context of being anti-imperialist and in the context of maintaining a social, let's say a strong social contract, to put it mildly, a communistic system. So what does that look like going forward into the future in regards to what needs to be done for the challenges that that Cuba is faced with?
Well, a big part of the Central Report, which of course the Central Report is reflecting on the last 5 years since the 7th Congress of the party. And it talks about the economic and social model of socialist development and what that requires. And they say that it requires them to properly regulate the market as harmoniously as possible, and that it needs to ensure that the unsatisfied demands of the population constitute an incentive for national producers, because of the U.S. blockade, which spans 6 decades on Cuba. Cuba has had to produce a lot of its own food, a lot of its own parts, a lot of technology, and of course we know that has led to a lot of development in health and in science. But so this is something that they have to continue, and as part of the party work is always examining the work of the actual government, because the party runs parallel and overlapping with the government. But they also spoke about the role of foreign investment, and a lot of things that have been widely misunderstood from the exterior, but the ways in which those things actually help strengthen the government or the economy.
Camilla, one last question. We've only got a minute or two left with you, so I'll keep it quick. He may not, Miguel may not have a difference in policy. He may not significantly shake up Cuba's policies, either foreign or domestic. But what about character or as personality? In other words, as a leader, who is he? How is he going to differ from both Raul and Fidel? If you could explain this to a Western audience, how is he significantly different as a person from the previous leaders of the country? Mila.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think he is a whole lot younger. He's had a very large presence on the ground among students. Appearing at these historical celebrations. I think people were very quick to take him in and accept him as the new leader of the government 3 years ago. Something that I was a little bit surprised by myself. So I think we've kind of yet to see, in what ways he influences things and puts his own flavor on things. But of course, the way in which the government and party deals with issues such as social issues really doesn't come is really not the responsibility of one single individual. It's the responsibility of counseling with different groups such as the Women's Federation of Cuba. So I do think some people have characterized him as being a bit conservative, but I think that it won't really play as much of a role. And he's just, someone to guide the process. But there are lots of other strong revolutionary leaders working alongside him as well.
Camilla, one quick question before we head out. There are about 30 seconds or a minute. Internationalism. From the standpoint of this not being a singular or unipolar world anymore, meaning the sanctions that the U.S. was putting on, the blockade against Cuba for the 60 years, is with the rise of China, with the rise of Russia, and you could even say this kind of organization of China, Russia, and Iran in these kind of global affairs, just because of the way the U.S. has kind of pushed these countries together. Does Cuba play into that? And is the blockade undermined by there being a multipolar world as opposed to this kind of singular world order?
Yes, absolutely. It's completely undermined. And during a whole section of the Central Report, Raul Castro spoke about the extent to which they were able to consolidate and extend those important strategic relations, that bilateral cooperation with a number of countries, namely Russia for decades, as well as Asian countries, which are also socialist, about 4 major countries there, including China, as you said, and a number of Caribbean countries and countries of the African Union. So this has played a massive role, although, they emphasize, as well as Venezuela, that the international community needs to continue to, work around and over these sanctions to make sure that people's, human rights aren't violated by this economic blockade that has actually increased in its effects because of COVID-19.
Oh, and the vaccines. It's a good thing that Cuba has emphasized its ability for vaccinations, because other countries like Brazil, who didn't produce their vaccines, were slammed by it, whereas Cuba, despite having to deal with COVID, were able to even send their doctors and are producing multiple vaccines. So, Camilla, thank you for this. I really do appreciate you joining us. The voice that you guys were listening to is Camilla Escalante. She's a TV producer and presenter at Telesur English, who also works with Keshwan News. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming up is The Wrap. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Join Sputnik News for a special broadcast of Vladimir Putin's annual address to the Federal Assembly on April the 21st. Tune in to the show or catch us streaming on the web at sputniknews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're in the wrap. That means we're taking your calls in the last segment of today's show, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. One quick note, as you were listening over the break, if you heard that one promo, that one ad, we are going to be airing Putin's State of the Nation address tomorrow in full. Now, this is in preparation, it coming a week before Biden is set to do not his State of the Union address, but a sort of joint address to Congress that is acting as a surrogate or the State of the Union that for some reason he's not doing. Anyway, we're going to be airing this in full. We're going to be talking about it extensively on tomorrow's show. Just a heads up that during the first hour and probably a bit longer than that, probably cutting into the second hour, we're going to be playing that. It's going to be a kind of special edition of Fault Lines. Anyway, heads up on that. Pay attention to it. Should be interesting. Having said that, we are taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Let's go to Michael, calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on. What's going on?
Yeah, hey, guys. First of all, I'd like to start up by saying, just following up on what you said, I don't believe Biden's doing a State of the Union because I don't believe he really believes in unions. So it doesn't surprise me he's not doing a State of the Union address. And I'd just like to say, like, this show tonight has been, like, just chock full of juicy tidbits, and it's just, like, one of the best broadcasts I've heard ever on Fault Lines, and I've been looking forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, no,
especially since the show, didn't even go off without a hitch. Like, there were things we had to do behind the back end and everything else, so thank you. I appreciate it.
No, like, it's like literally like, I love this show. I'm actually, I talked about my experience last night, is where I'll pick up. But I actually have 4 beautiful young ladies staying in my house tonight who actually are full legit A-list celebrities in China. Because apparently I'm quite a celebrity over there. I'm on Douyin. And they often invite many girls in my house, and currently there's in excess of at least 30 women in my house.
Wait, what? Hold on a second, Michael. There are in excess of 30 women in your house right now? What are you saying, man? That sounds like a fire hazard.
No, mate. I'm the full legit only male here, and my girlfriend is a very lovely lady, and I respect her very much, and she has lots of beautiful friends. And
apparently she respects and trusts you too, dude. 29 other women. How are you even fitting them? Do you live in a mansion? What is going on? Michael, I'm sorry. I just need to do a special detour.
I live in a 3-bedroom housing commission place in Sydney called Tilapia, but I call it Utopia now.
It's either, but I'm just going to point out that's either 10 women in every bedroom or 30 all in your one room. And unless you have a big bed, that sounds like a catastrophe.
It's not a bad place. I've got like a kitchen and a dining room, a small dining room and a small kitchen, a rather large lounge room, and 3 bedrooms. But no, they don't all stay here. Most of them go home at night. Some stay here.
Okay, good.
But like moving on from that, but like I'd like to pick up on the other policing issue, which I picked up on the other night, or I tried to pick up on the other night around Derek Chauvin. I think that is just premeditated, cold-blooded murder. Make no bones about it. But as Shane, you have picked up on tonight, the Black Lives Matter is being totally disingenuous. I think they should change it to My 4 Homes Matter instead of Black Lives Matter. So basically all they're doing is shit. All they're doing is sheepdogging people in the Democratic Party to vote for Joe Biden, and I call her Camilla the Killer. Who puts homeless women in jail for having truant children who can't register their children to go to school because they're homeless and have no fixed address, and laughs about in smoking marijuana while incarcerating people for life for smoking marijuana. I mean, I call it Camilla the Killer, or Camilla the Hun. Or Killer the Hun. But yeah, I mean, she is just a psychopath, and Joe Biden's just a senile psychopath. Who forgets he's a psychopath, and people call him Uncle Joe because, everyone's got an Uncle Joe in their family. I'm probably the Uncle Joe in my family. But it wasn't for the fact that actually I had 4 lovely young ladies here who are full legit, like A-list celebrities in China, sort of recording on their phones what was going on. I think I would have been over-policed. But anyway, I'd just like to just basically point out, it's just crazy. I mean, you got Derek Chauvin and what's going on, Black Lives Matter, and you've got this lady who appeared. I saw it on Karen Waters or whatever her name is, Gillian Waters. I saw her on Ron Paul. I mean, I watched Ron Paul too. I love his show. And she looked like a total freak. I mean, she was dressed in some spacesuit, going out to this protest and preaching about revolting. I mean, hasn't she had the coronavirus vaccine? And I don't
know who you're talking about there, Michael. I've got no clue who that is.
So Carolyn Waters, I think her name was. She went out to the protest and was saying, basically, if they don't basically hang Chauvin, capital punishment. Basically, we should go out and riot. Basically.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good. I don't approve of that. Just to be clear, I don't like the death penalty in general. But no, hanging the dude.
Yeah, it's anti-libertarian. Basically,
Michael, we got other calls and we're taking more. No, but thank you for the call. I appreciate it, man. 202-521-1320 is the number. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you are on the line. What's on your mind?
So yeah, I have 4 quick comments. Pre-joining science, Noam Chomsky been tweeting out joining science quotes, which is good. Michael Brown father about last month was asking for a big chunk of the tens of millions of dollars of BLM had raised, because BLM basically used up, people that have been brutalized or killed by policemen in their campaigns, and they raise money, and where that money go to? Does it go to lawyers, healthcare bills, get people out of jail that's been wrongly convicted, so forth and so forth? That they need to open up the books and say what his money is going to. And also,
agreed.
2 movies I've seen over the past 2 months that is not from a Western point of view. It's from like the Asian, like a Chinese and Korean point of view. One movie called The Wandering Earth I saw. Pretty good. It could have been done better, but it was about people working together, all the billions of people working together to escape the sun from exploding and going to another star system.
I thought that was when the planet was roaming the galaxy, like Earth was knocked out of his orbit or something. Is that what that was?
Yeah, it's Wandering Earth. No, the sun was expanding, and they had to put rocket engines the size of mountains.
That's what it was. Okay,
that sounds kind of far-fetched.
Yeah.
That doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but anyway, they had another movie I just saw last night. A Korean movie, man. It was pretty good. It was called Space Sweepers. And basically it's about people in space, and the planet Earth is being destroyed, and they had this super trend being there. He was going to take technology to Mars and take all the best people off Earth and bring them there. And I didn't want to tell a story, but you got to check it out. It's almost like they're putting their finger at a particular person on the planet.
That sounds like it. I'm guessing you're talking to Elon Musk, not to name names, but Tarif, thank you for the call. We've got an impromptu movie review coming out of Tarif, calling in from New Orleans.
By the way, speaking of the Elon Musk thing real quick, Elon Musk, that brain thing that he's talking about, he's trying to have that by the end of the year.
It's not going to happen. I mean, you're going to have a tech demo.
There's another part to that.
Demo sounds.
He also has a device with the idea of injecting it into people's heads. So the thought is, because it's a logic thing, right? It's like, all right, we have this device that puts in people's head. Great. Well, how do you expand that if you have to have this kind of massive surgical procedure? Okay, well, what if you had a device where you can just kind of go like the McDonald's and get it slammed into your head? Well, they have a medical device that tries to automatically put the thing into people's heads. I'm telling you, man, it's going to start off with something like blindness, and it's going to escalate. It's going to escalate.
You've watched Star Trek enough to be familiar, I'm very sure, with the Borg. And that sounds like how you would get to the Borg. Yeah, that sounds like pretty much the direct route to a hive mind system. And that is the truly fiction-y part of science fiction, at least right now. But there's nothing like having a device that automatically inserts something into people's heads that is going to scare off the population justifiably.
And by the way, think about what could take place. They're going to have to say, hey, is it okay if we do systems monitoring of the device? Now, if you say yes, that systems monitoring could really be just monitoring you, your neurological functions, how you function, how your body operates, and everything else over the course of X number of years, so they can correlate the information to get more information on what goes on internally into the human being. Like, all of this stuff comes into play. What happens if there's a virus? What happens if there's a virus? And the individual, how does that virus plug into the person's perception of reality? For all we know, a virus could be injected to make the person think there's an alien attack. And the guy's running through the streets. Oh my God, they're getting me. They're going to get me. And you find, I'm trying to get across that your reality is entirely operated from your perspective of the world. Meaning, the only thing that you experience is what is going on in your brain at any particular moment. sight, sounds, all of that stuff. That stuff are electrical
Always.
signals. That's all.
One.
If you have a device that can control it, it gets weird. Shane?
Again, and it's starting to be more science than fiction at this point, although we're still a ways away from it being fact. Did you ever see Black Mirror? We got to close, but did you ever see
Black
that
Mirror.
show?
Love it.
You love it? Love it? I thought that would have been a little bit too cynical or dystopian or something for you. But yeah, in some ways, Black Mirror was arguably a little bit too optimistic based on how a lot of key trajectories are heading. Like a lot of the societies they cover are more or less functional in some way. And it's just this one part that's really screwed up. But it seems like there's a lot of grounds for a lot of things to be screwed up. Anyway, we got to close out today's show. I want to thank everybody for calling in and listening. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. Thank you, Engineer Andre, our engineer. Thank you to every guest who made an appearance this morning. And thank you again for listening. We'll be back tomorrow morning, folks, at 7 a.m. Eastern, signing off Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. A really good show today. A really, really good show today. And keep in mind, this was a strong show, despite the fact that one of the guests just blew us off entirely. You probably wouldn't even know which guest blew us off or which section we got blown off because the show was actually quite strong all the way through. Good back and forths, a lot of energy. I don't have any complaints. And just because I disagree with something doesn't mean it's bad, if that makes sense. I mean, we can have our fights and, it's Fault Lines, so those shows end up being good, even within those fights. Shane doesn't know that Jamal likes Black Mirror. Yeah, I don't know about that one either, Kishwari Kate. I don't know why Shane doesn't know that. Love Black Mirror. Love that. One of my favorite shows. And Shwari, you know I like it just because you've seen me do 420s where we've talked about Black Mirror in detail. Love it. I can't believe that Shane doesn't know that. But that's all right. We've only worked together for a few months. And I don't think we've got into the movies and stuff like that. So I thought The President and the Pig was a happy ending. Yeah, that was a dark one. And it was the Prime Minister. So for those who don't know, one of the episodes of Black Mirror has to do with one of a royalty. I think it was like the princess being kidnapped. Now, while the princess was being kidnapped, an email or letter or document went out that says, unless the Prime Minister has sex with a pig and shows the pig, has the very specific details that needs to take place for him to have sex with the pig, has the video camera that needs to be shown, and it needs to be shown to the wider world while it happens. Unless he has sex with that pig, the queen, the princess gets it. Now, start from here and think about real world phenomena and politics. What happens? That was that episode. And it's so dark. Like, it gets to the point where the Prime Minister is basically using the polling data to make a determination on whether or not he's going to have sex with that pig. And it gets to the point where they try a raid. The raid goes bad. The public starts having a perspective of the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister grabs that pig and What's wild about it is that it has to be a straight shot, meaning you can't have any camera angles. The video has to be in a way where you could see him satisfying that pig, or at the very least, trying to satisfy that pig. And the Prime Minister does. The Prime Minister has sex with that pig. He gets in on that pig. And you could see the frustration on his face as he's having difficulty finishing. And what's more dystopian than not is that the princess had been released before the Prime Minister started having sex with the pig. The woman who was head of state or head of the secretary for the Prime Minister learns that the princess was out in advance and destroys the information to let him know that he's out. So from the Prime Minister's standpoint, what he did saved the princess. He didn't know that the princess was already safe and that the sex with the pig was just sex with a pig. It wasn't saving anybody. That's a really dark episode. That's a really dark episode. And then you get this secondary aspect where him and his wife, like several years later, they're like saying, yeah, hello, everything's great. We're great. And then they go in their separate ways because the wife can't deal with the Prime Minister or her husband who satisfied a pig on national television. Yeah, it wasn't the pig that was satisfied Spider. I don't think the pig was satisfied either. You're right. You're right. The pig didn't ask for that. The pig was a victim in that whole process. Yeah, that pig was a victim. All right, I'm going to end this here. Yeah, good show, guys. And thank you all for joining us, man. I'm going to say like. I'm going to say definitely share it if you enjoy it and you think that this is a great show, Fault Lines. And I'm definitely going to say subscribe. I will see you guys a little bit later today. Aspire for Peace. Yeah, I saw Chad President died after clashes with rebels. Yeah, right here. I think I have it up. At least I thought I had it up. I mean, the thing is, we follow news all over the world. And because we do, we have this quirk of being aware of pretty much everything that goes on around the world, even if it's not entirely dramatically in depth. But yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Guys, I am going, I'll think about that later. All right, I'm going to end this here. Guys, if you dig it, definitely hit the like button. Definitely hit the share button. And I'll see you guys a little bit later today. Thanks all.